do know I know you're listening, right? I know you're looking directly at me, aren't you? Here's the thing. The information I gave is not worth $6. It's worth a lot more. Do I make myself clear? No, it's not a threat. Don't take it out of context. I'm being polite. Alright?
I think what makes that video intriguing for people to watch is what he's saying. It's almost comical.
So, we can do this the nice way, and we negotiate.
Some people may watch that and think, well, he doesn't know the difference between right and wrong.
Or we can do it the hard way, and I can release my bipolar.
Trust me when I tell you, he knows the difference between right and wrong. In the long run, this is about a murder. This is a serious crime with someone losing their life.
Dude, there's blood everywhere.
Yeah.
It was a very violent death.
He was just all around a good guy. And he didn't deserve what happened.
I still don't know if we know every specific bit of God's honest truth. What it boiled down to is a cold, calculated, pre-planned homicide. It was a way for them to be together as a couple.
Clock's ticking.
Medford, Oregon is a quiet community deep in the heart of the rustic Rogue Valley.
Medford is located in southern Oregon. We're about 30 miles from the California border. We're close to mountains, we're close to the ocean, hiking, camping. I have been a Medford police officer for almost 30 years. It's a department that really cares about their community.
On October 2nd, 2017, the Medford Police Department receives an alarming 911 call from a local resident.
The call came in at 6:42. It was from Aaron Friar's girlfriend.
Aaron is a 50-year-old Medford resident and handyman. He's also the father of 3 girls. His girlfriend reports that Aaron and his oldest daughter, Ellie, are missing.
The girlfriend said Aaron's younger daughters woke up about 6:30 in the morning, and all of a sudden, they see blood there. And they don't know where dad is, and they don't know where older sister is. His 15-year-old daughter, Ellie Friar, was missing from the residence.
So they called Dad's girlfriend. She came to the house, saw the state of the house, and they ultimately decided to walk to their mom's house down the street and call for help.
Our officers were dispatched to the residence.
The address is in West Medford. It's an older neighborhood with older homes.
Medford police. Medford police.
Patrol officers, they entered the residence. At that point, they're in a life-saving mode to figure out what's going on. They're checking for any place that a human body can be at, whether they're injured or whether they're deceased.
Police department, be in here, announce yourself.
Dude, there's blood everywhere.
Yeah.
They basically searched the house looking for the father, Aaron Friar, and his 15-year-old daughter, Ellie Friar. They found blood on the couch inside the front room. Based on the amount of blood that was there, we believed that it was a possible no-body homicide. That they had been assaulted and then possibly taken somewhere or removed from the house deceased.
Let's get out of here.
All right, let's back out.
Yep.
And
Lock it down.
Lock it down.
When detectives arrive at the scene, responding officers walk them through their initial discoveries.
Officer Logan Boyd had followed the blood path out of the residence.
So you kind of see it starts from there and kind of goes all the way out in the dirt.
It goes out towards the carport.
Yeah. That's not good. I bet his car was parked here. It almost looks like someone came out this way.
They're not at any hospital?
No. Dispatch checked out almost kind of right out of the chute.
So at this point in a girlfriend interview,
Anyone and everyone is talked to that has knowledge or knows the people that are involved in this case. Our goal is to figure out what's going on and find the people that we need to find.
Originally from California, Aaron Friar left a lasting impression on everyone he met.
I grew up with Aaron in Lompoc. He was like best friend you could ever have. He'd give you the shirt off his back. That's the kind of guy he was.
Aaron was very outgoing, always wanting to make you laugh, wanting to be the friend that made sure you had a good time. He was very outgoing, bubbly personality.
In 2000, Aaron moved to Oregon where he settled down.
Aaron met his wife, Maggie, in Medford.
He seemed happy. You could tell it. You know, it radiated from him. I was happy for him.
Over the next 8 years, Aaron and his wife welcomed 3 daughters.
Aaron, with his girls, they were his world. And I saw it firsthand. You know, when I went up there to visit, he would take me to school to go pick him up. He loved those girls more than anything.
The couple's oldest daughter, Ellen, or Ellie to her friends and family, shined particularly bright.
Ellie was definitely a smart girl. She was in all of the advanced placement classes with me.
We were in band together. She was super talented. She's good at the clarinet. Ellie was a super friendly individual, very quiet, maybe a little socially awkward, but always super nice, funny, you know.
Aaron was proud of her because she did a lot of recitals in school. Every time he'd come visit, he'd have those on his phone and he would just have to show me.
After more than a decade of marriage, Aaron and his wife decided to separate in 2014.
When they split up, didn't move that far, and they co-parented without really any agreement of who gets who when. And that seemed to be working really well for them.
The girl's mother, she actually lived within about a block and a half of Aaron's house. So the girls, they would go back and forth between his house there and their mother's house.
When it was his turn to have them over his house, he was all about that. Aaron wanted to be at home with them. He wanted to spend time with them. Aaron would encourage Ellie to play music, and they would all have jam sessions together and listen to her sing. He'd love to hear Ellie sing.
He lived for them kids. That was his main concern.
By 2017, Aaron's 3 girls, ages 8, 11, and 15, seemed to have adjusted well to their new life. That same year, Aaron was back on the dating scene.
He started dating a woman who I became friends with. Her name was Mickey. She was wonderful, very nice. They seemed to hit it off really well.
Aaron, his new girlfriend, and Maggie, his ex-wife, they got along great. She liked all the kids liked her. It was a good dynamic.
They definitely seemed like a happy family.
But on October 2nd, Aaron and his eldest daughter are missing. And Medford police are searching for witnesses who can explain what happened to them.
There's a lot of moving pieces. We have to start canvassing the neighborhood, looking for witnesses.
Detectives head to Aaron's ex-wife's house to speak with Aaron's girlfriend, Mickey, who had called 911 earlier that morning. She explains that she last saw Aaron the night before, and he and the girls were in good spirits.
Ellie and all the girls were over there last night.
They were staying over there last night. What time did you leave?
I left at 9. I went home.
And it was just Aaron and his 3 daughters.
Yes, and when I left, everybody was situated.
Okay.
They were getting ready for bed. It was a normal Sunday night.
Okay.
Mickey confirms that Erin's car, a silver Mercury Marquis, was parked under the carport when she left.
So once we know that Erin's vehicle was also missing from the residence, immediately we have all of our officers out looking for the car. We don't know if they're still alive, he's been kidnapped, she's been kidnapped. We don't really know a lot on the front end of this until we can start digging and figuring out what's going on. You really turn it into a life-saving situation at that point.
Coming up, police learn new details as Erin Friar's youngest daughters recount a harrowing ordeal.
She woke up to her dad yelling and the sound of something crashing. She's afraid to leave the room. It was actually heartbreaking.
And a troubling allegation exposes a sinister motive.
They definitely had this Romeo and Juliet kind of situation where they wanted to be together, but everybody was telling them they couldn't be.
Medford police are searching for 50-year-old Aaron Friar and his 15-year-old daughter, Ellie, after his younger daughters discovered a bloodbath inside their home. Authorities put out an APB for Aaron's missing vehicle, while detectives canvass the neighborhood.
There is surveillance all around that neighborhood. People these days have cameras on their houses, and we find a surveillance video that shows the car leaving.
The footage captures Aaron's silver Mercury pulling away from the home at 5:39 a.m. While this helps establish a timeline, detectives are unable to identify the driver.
Fortunately for us, we have the two young daughters that were in the house when this occurred to tell us everything they know and walk us through stuff. This information is key.
Detectives make arrangements to speak with Aaron's daughters.
I was assigned with talking to the two young sisters who were possible witnesses to what had happened at the house. They were 11 and 8 at the time. I made contact with the mother and asked her to bring the girls to the Children's Advocacy Center so that I could interview them there.
A few hours later, the two girls and their mother come in for an interview.
With interviewing children, we don't jump right into the topic of concern. We build some rapport, go over some ground rules about how the interview is going to happen. The girls were obviously scared and upset. It was actually heartbreaking. The older sister had the most information. She heard and saw a lot. She knew something bad had happened. She woke up to her dad yelling and the sound of something crashing at 5 o'clock in the morning. She's afraid to leave the room.
According to Aaron's middle daughter, she and her sister eventually fell back to sleep.
Ultimately, at 6:15, she gets up because she needs to get up and go to school. And she comes out into the living room and goes to the couch and puts her hand on the couch. And when she takes her hand away, it's bloody. She turned on the light and was shocked because there was blood everywhere. She used her dad's phone next to the couch to get the phone number for her dad's girlfriend. And she called and asked her to come over.
But Aaron's daughter reveals that while she was hiding out in her and her sister's room, she recognized a familiar voice coming from the living room.
The older sister tells me during the interview that after the crash with her dad, she hears Gavin.
Detectives learn that Gavin MacFarlane is Ellie's 19-year-old ex-boyfriend.
She's concerned because she knows that Gavin's not allowed to be at the house. She told me that he was a, quote, mysterious person and that her dad hated him. At this point, we were trying to find more information about Gavin.
I first met Gavin my freshman year of high school at South Medford. Gavin was older than Ellie and was already graduated. I just kind of remember seeing Ellie and Gavin hanging out, despite no longer being a student there. he just kind of had a specific kind of like a darker vibes, like mystique surrounding Gavin. I would see Gavin like waiting outside the front, kind of where the parents' staff parking lot, where parents come to pick up their kids. He'd be hanging out there with a skateboard, and then Ellie would come out to meet him, and they would walk off, into the town together. They definitely seemed like a happy couple. Ellie seemed almost head over heels for him.
Ellie's father, on the other hand, wasn't happy when he learned about his daughter's relationship.
Aaron would tell me that the guy is a bad seed and not a good influence on Ellie because Ellie was doing very well in school. She was doing her band and everything. But I think Gavin held her back.
Ellie had recently gotten into trouble for lying about where she was at on the weekends. She had told her dad that she was staying with a friend, and her dad found out that she was actually at Gavin's house.
Ellie's mother tells detectives that Aaron had forbidden their daughter from dating Gavin, leading to a tense confrontation outside Gavin's home only a month before Aaron and Ellie went missing.
About a month prior, Gavin MacFarlane calls the police department to report that Aaron Friar is at his residence, threatening to kill him. We respond over to the residence, an officer does, makes contact, and Aaron's saying, yeah, I'm upset. He's 19 years old, my daughter's 15. I've told him I don't want him around my daughter, but yet he keeps coming around my daughter, and he's involved in a relationship with her.
The animosity between Aaron and Gavin suggests a clear motive to detectives.
We don't even know 100% sure who's been injured at the residence. Because there's blood on a couch, it's not in a bed in a certain person's bedroom. But we kind of figured that something had happened to Aaron and Ellie, and that it more than likely involved Ellie's boyfriend.
Ellie's mom was understandably worried, and the girls were worried and extremely tired. After I was done interviewing the girls, I talked to their mom, and I just said, as soon as I have updates for you, I'll let you know.
We had every patrol officer, every individual in the county, everyone's looking for this missing vehicle that belonged to Aaron. Very quickly, our officers find it up in East Medford, parked on the street.
Unfortunately, there's no sign of Aaron, Ellie, or Gavin, and a sweep of the vehicle turns up no evidence. Detectives focus all efforts on locating Gavin immediately.
We began doing what's called a geofence or a geoping for the location of the cell phone. We have this phone ping going on Gavin MacFarlane's phone. That phone ping leads us to a certain area of Medford.
As officers scour the neighborhood where Gavin's phone last pinged, there is a stunning development.
Detective Jim Williams was driving down Barnett Road, which is a major thoroughfare, and he spots Ellie Friar just walking down the street with Gavin.
Police in Medford, Oregon have just spotted missing person Ellie Friar with her ex-boyfriend Gavin MacFarlane. To authorities' surprise, Ellie appears to be unharmed.
I learned that Gavin, Ellie, and a third person had been located.
Officers discover that the third person is 22-year-old Russell Jones.
I had been told that Russell Jones, Ellie Friar, and Gavin MacFarlane were being brought to the Medford Police Department. I already knew who Russell was. I had had a prior case with Russell Jones He was involved in a burglary and taking his grandparents' property. Aaron's vehicle was found very close to Russell Jones' grandparents' residence.
While Ellie Friar and Gavin MacFarlane refuse to talk, Russell causes concern for law enforcement.
But did you happen to notice my wrists at all?
Your what?
My wrists.
Your wrists? What about them?
Well,
the thing
is that I can dislocate my wrist.
Okay, don't do that though, please.
Okay. You seem like a nice one. So
I appreciate it.
I won't make it hard on you.
All right.
I only make it hard on the bad ones.
Okay.
He is a strange individual. Very talkative, talks very fast, more than regular.
I actually started my own protection business.
You actually started a what business?
Protection business.
What kind of protection?
When people are, I know it's kind of risky. But I work with people 20 and younger, legally considered runaways.
Okay, so you're gonna protect like runaways?
Well, they need to run away for some reason.
So you provide protection for runaways and get them like a place to live?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's now around 11:30 in the morning. All three subjects had been brought into the Medford Police Department.
All right, we're coming out.
We separate all three of them.
Just bring us straight into that first room on the left.
First room on the left?
Yeah.
They're all placed in different interview rooms.
Go and have a seat there, bud.
Obviously, you don't want people talking to each other.
While the three suspects wait to speak with detectives, Russell's behavior becomes increasingly bizarre.
You do know I know you're listening, right? So listen here. You want the whole story? Ellie and Gavin are to be put in this room, and I'll give you a total of, let's set our clock, shall we? $2 hours. All charges are to be dropped, and every recording is to be destroyed. I know cops are really good at that. Oh, I misplaced that file. I know your sick, twisted games, boy.
When detectives enter the interrogation room, Russell's demeanor appears to shift, and he's willing to cooperate.
So what is it that you do? Protection mostly. Yeah? Yeah, IDs. That way they can have a new identity and stuff like that, along with their new life after I protect them and all that. But of course that's nothing to brag about because that's federally against the law.
In an interview room down the hall, another detective meets with Ellie Friar.
I was assigned to interview Ellie, and she's small, she's petite.
Hi. Hello. Are you Ellie? No. What's your name? I have the right to remain silent.
Okay. I at least need to know your name, though. You don't want to tell me your name?
Rain.
Rain? Okay. Okay, Rain, well, if you choose that you want to talk, I'm around, okay?
Why am I being detained?
Well, it's kind of tricky to go into all of that when you don't want to talk, but...
I would like to know why I'm in handcuffs and why I'm detained. I have the right to know.
Okay. So we got a call of concern at your house today, and your little sisters are pretty scared about what happened there. And so what we're doing is trying to figure out what happened. And
I haven't been there all night.
Yeah, so kind of that's what we need to hash out, you know? What did your sisters see? Why are they worried?
Yeah, what did they see?
That's what I'm going to ask you.
To be honest, I don't have a clue.
So this morning, your little sisters told your mom about something that worried them that they saw in your house. And what that was a large amount of blood.
Is everybody okay?
That's what we're trying to figure out.
It was important for me to let her talk, to establish a rapport, to ask open-ended questions. And that's kind of what I tried to do from the beginning.
Do you have a boyfriend?
My parents made us break up.
Tell me about that.
They just didn't like him.
Okay. So what was that circumstance, though? Tell me about that.
My parents are very controlling. My dad is very abusive.
In what way?
Verbally, emotionally, and a few times when I did something that he didn't like, he would grab me right here and he'd pin me against the wall.
Ellie outlines that she had shared this allegation of abuse with her boyfriend, Gavin.
Ellie just wanted her dad out of her life so she could be with Gavin. And Gavin gets his buddy Russell involved in it. And Russell's the protector.
According to Ellie, she had been removing items of hers from her home, putting them outside, and then Gavin would come and pick them up and take them to his home.
We got my stuff. I was planning to run away.
Ellie explains that the night before she planned to sneak out of her home, but when Gavin and Russell arrived outside her bedroom window, Russell was armed with a machete.
Russell attacked my father.
Okay, tell me everything you know about that.
She told us that Russell had went through the window and was in Ellie's bedroom.
Ellie was putting everything on Russell. She admitted to me that he hurt her dad.
Where was your dad sleeping?
The couch.
Okay. And where were you when that happened?
In the back room.
Okay. So you were in the back room, and your dad was on the couch. And who else was in the house during this time?
Gavin was getting my stuff out onto the driveway.
Okay. And what's the very next thing that happened?
I guess my dad woke up, and he attacked. As soon as I heard screaming, I ran.
Coming up, authorities finally uncover the whereabouts of their true victim, Aaron Friar.
See it? Yep. How'd that get there? She tossed it.
And a chilling confession will leave police asking what really happened to Aaron Friar and who is responsible.
He demonstrated for us, took the bat with two hands, that he came up over the top of him, and that he drove the bat into his head 5 to 6 times.
Less than 24 hours after Aaron Friar's disappearance, his 15-year-old daughter Ellie has claimed that on the night she ran away from home, Russell Jones attacked her father with a machete.
I took my stuff and I ran, and Gavin caught up to me, and Russell caught up to me.
So tell me about the machete.
It has blood on it, but he wiped most of it away, and then he ditched it in the northern Walmart field.
Ellie, to me, was portraying herself at points as a victim. She was acting like she didn't know a lot about what had happened.
Detective Bill Ford confronts Russell with Ellie's claims.
He ends up telling us that the night prior around midnight, he wanted to help try to get Ellie out of a bad situation with her father. So he had been living with Gavin at the time.
So we headed over. We waited across the street, down the alley. We were waiting there till she texted saying that he's asleep.
He had a machete on him outside the house. In case something bad happened, he told us that him and Gavin were going to take Ellie back to Gavin's, and Ellie was going to live with Gavin.
He went through the gate, went through her window. So I followed. I stayed at the window. We were loading bags out and stuff. And we got all the bags loaded out.
But what Russell says happened next stands in stark contrast to Ellie's version of events.
So Gavin is still in the house?
Yes.
Ellie and you are outside the house?
Yes.
Okay, and then what happens?
He goes into the living room, beats the crap out of the guy. I walk through the front door and I see dead body.
He tells us that a bat was used, that Gavin's the one that used the bat, that Aaron was on the couch when Gavin assaulted him and killed him. It's just like strangest thing ever. He's not emotional. He's not upset. It's all like matter of fact, like it's just another day. Did you know going over last night
That Gavin was going to kill him? No.
or assault him?
Well, probably assault, but I didn't expect him to actually kill him. Just like probably a few broken ribs or something.
He tells us his only involvement was helping Gavin remove the body out of the house, put him in the tarp, put it in the trunk of the car, of Aaron's car, and then ultimately taking the body out to the county and dumping the body.
Russell agrees to take detectives to the location where they dumped Aaron Friar's body.
He directs us down Highway 140. We come back on a road called Antelope Road, and he takes us about, I think it was 7-8 miles up the road, and he tells us stop here. He tells us the body's right off the edge of the bank. We get out, we look down the bank, we see a green tarp rolled up, foot hanging out of the tarp, about 50 feet down the embankment.
As a team is called in to recover Aaron's body, Russell points out a key piece of evidence.
About 10 to 15 feet up in a tree kind of located behind the body, Russell says, "See the bat right there?" And I'm looking and I'm like, holy smokes, the bat did get hung up in a branch.
See it? Yep, right there. And so how'd that get there? She tossed it. Okay.
From up here or down there?
Oh, from up here. Actually, she kind of tripped.
He had told us that Ellie had thrown the bat, and he kind of snickers and laughs that Ellie had such a good arm. And it was kind of comical to him that the bat had been caught up in a bare tree branch. It was really kind of surreal.
When police recover Aaron Friar's body, a preliminary examination reveals that he died of blunt force trauma, which is consistent with Russell's account.
He had sustained massive trauma to the brain and the skull.
The discovery undermines Ellie's story that her dad was attacked with a machete. Detectives return to the police department where they confront Gavin MacFarlane.
Jim, can you pull up the pictures out on East Antelope? We have people out there right now recovering Ellie's dad. He's deceased.
So sorry. We're in prison for murder, aren't I?
Well, that's what we need to figure out here. We need to figure out what your intent was, and it's important to know.
Trying to protect Ellie.
That's when Gavin reveals the real reason why he needed to help Ellie.
She told you she was pregnant?
I've known for about 2 weeks now.
Okay.
According to Gavin, Ellie had confided in him about her father's alleged abuse the day before.
That's what set me off. I was just really angry at that moment.
Tell me about the anger.
The anger had just been building up because of the things that Ellie had been telling me.
Gavin was loyal and kind of ride or die. He would absolutely go along with pretty much any sort of crazy plan.
So you guys get over there.
You were just trying to be as quiet as possible.
And you think you arrived about 2:30?
Yeah.
Where was the bat at when you grabbed it?
It was in the bedroom.
In Ellie's bedroom?
Yeah.
He said it's very dark inside this residence. He trips on a plastic bin. It makes some noise. It wakes Dad up.
And then he starts to wake up, and I just acted on instinct.
And he demonstrated for us that he took the bat with 2 hands, that he came up over the top of him, and that he drove the bat into his head 5 to 6 times.
I just swung the bat downwards. It was dark, I couldn't see, so I don't know what I was doing.
He kept saying, I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't want to kill him. Well, somebody takes a bat with 2 hands, an aluminum bat, and swings it up over the top of him. Anybody in their right mind should know that that could cause death.
We got a couple more questions for you. Whose idea was it to cause harm to her dad? Who first brought it up?
She did.
In Medford, Oregon, Gavin MacFarlane has just admitted that his girlfriend Ellie Friar came up with the idea to murder her father, Aaron.
So she hands you the bat in the bedroom and tells you to go take Dad out. What were her exact words?
She said go out in the front room, take him out, and text me and let me know when it's done. I was thinking, is this really happening? I'm about to go kill someone. I stopped and I kind of sat there frozen. I didn't know what to do. And so.
When detectives confront Ellie about Gavin's claims, she continues to play innocent.
It seems like this was planned. It seems like doing something to your dad is something that the 3 of you talked about before it actually happened.
We all planned to get me out of the house, but that's all I was involved in.
In talking to Ellie, it was super frustrating. I knew she was lying. There were nonverbal cues as well, like trying to be distracting, like drinking the water, like coughing.
I feel like you're really minimizing your part in this, Ellie. Because Gavin is in there, and he's really kind of laying it all out. So why have we been going in circles?
I don't know.
Once she started realizing that we were putting the pieces of the puzzle together, then she was becoming more truthful about what had happened.
Tell me what kinds of things you guys were talking about.
About how we were in love, we would get married. I said, I'm ready when you are.
Okay, what did you mean by that?
When you do this, we're in it together.
And what did you mean by that, specifically?
Exactly what I said. We're in it together.
What did you mean when you said, when you do this?
Kill my dad.
She was admitting at least some of her part in the homicide. I think that was a turning point. It was a very violent death. I think Ellie definitely knew how violent of a death it was. And she was still blasé about the whole thing. Like, no reaction.
And tell me, what is the first thing somebody says when you get in the car?
Can't believe we actually did that.
How'd you guys feel?
We were all kind of on an adrenaline rush.
Following their interviews, Ellie, Gavin, and Russell are charged on multiple counts, including murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Despite her age, Ellie is charged as an adult.
I was floored. What happened with Aaron was such a shock. I believe all of Medford was definitely shooken up.
I just couldn't believe it. Little girl Ellie, I couldn't believe it.
As authorities continue building their case, they learn that Ellie Friar is not pregnant. They also find no evidence that she was ever abused by her father.
During the course of the investigation, we never found any evidence or signs of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse by Aaron Friar to Ellie or his 2 younger daughters.
Ellie's a manipulator. I think even though she's 15 going on 20. She wanted things in her life. She wanted them to be a certain way.
I think that they had like this Romeo and Juliet situation where Ellie and Gavin wanted to be together, but everybody was telling them they couldn't be.
Ellie wanted her dad killed. And that was a way for them to be together as a couple.
When detectives execute a search warrant at Gavin's house, they secure evidence proving Gavin and Ellie had planned Aaron's death together.
We found letters, drawings, written out documents by Gavin, lots of them, about planning different ways to do this. I mean, this was a cold, calculated, pre-planned homicide.
And also, we had a search warrant for cell phone text conversations that she was having with Russell and Gavin about killing her dad.
There was talk of getting chloroform, putting it over Aaron's face, knocking him out, putting him in a car, taking him to California, murdering him way out in the county somewhere. Ultimately, they get a text from Ellie to come over and kill him there. Russell has this beat-up old motorhome, and they were going to make their way to the motorhome and take off and go across the nation. And life's going to be grand.
Facing a mountain of evidence, both Ellie Friar and Gavin MacFarlane make deals with the prosecution.
Mr. MacFarlane pled guilty to murder. Under Oregon law, he received a sentence of life with a mandatory minimum 25 years in prison. Ms. Friar pled guilty to the conspiracy charges and then was sentenced to 25 years.
Ellie should have gotten the brunt of the guilt. But I understand that Gavin is still the person who murdered Ellie's father, and I think 25 years to life is the punishment for that.
In August 2021, Russell Jones pleads no contest to conspiracy to commit murder and attempted robbery. He is sentenced to 15 years.
As far as their sentencing go, I believe it's all fair. I think they all need to be in there for their full term.
The saddest part is that the two little girls no longer have their father. And that's because their 15-year-old sister went to great lengths to make sure he was killed.
On October 3rd, still 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessup disappeared from the small Ontario community of Queensville, and for the next 36 years, her murder would remain one of Canada's most haunting cold cases. There was no dramatic warning, no public confrontation, no obvious struggle witnessed by a passer. Christine was simply there, a child in a rural community north of Toronto, and then she was gone. That disappearance would trigger a massive search, a murder investigation, a wrongful conviction, years of legal battle, and a national debate about how easily an investigation can lose its way. But the most astonishing chapter would come decades later, when technology transformed a tiny biological clue preserved from the original investigation into a name. That name was Calvin Hoover, and by the time investigators reached him, he had already been dead for 5 years. The story began in a community where people knew one another, where families visited each other, where children moved through familiar streets without the constant fear that would later become associated with Christine's disappearance. Christine was remembered by those who knew her as a lively 9-year-old who loved her family's school and sport. On that October afternoon, she was last seen after going to a local general store to buy bubble gum. Then the ordinary rhythm of the day was shattered. Her family realized she was missing, and what followed was a frantic search that rapidly expanded beyond Queensville. Her face appeared on television and in newspapers across the country. Volunteers searched. Police investigated. Neighbors were questioned. Every possibility had to be considered. Somewhere in the uncertainty was a terrible reality. Christine had not simply wandered away. She had been abducted. Months later, the search ended in the worst possible way. On December 31st, still 1984, her body was discovered in a field in the Sunderland area, roughly 55 to 56 kilometers from her home. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. The disappearance had become a homicide, and the community that had spent months hoping for Christine's return was forced to confront a crime that seemed almost impossible to understand. The investigation now had a crime scene, a victim, forensic evidence, and a desperate question. Who had done this? Among the people who came under suspicion was Christine's neighbor, Guy Paul Morin. The investigation focused heavily on him, and in 1985, he was arrested. The case against Morin would eventually become one of Canada's most notorious examples of wrongful conviction. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. But the evidence that appeared persuasive at the time would later collapse under the power of DNA testing. Morin willingly provided biological samples during the investigation, and years later, scientific testing demonstrated that the biological material connected with Christine's murder did not belong to him. His conviction was overturned in 1995 after 2 trials, an appeal, and years of legal struggle. The man who had been labeled a murderer was not the murderer. The case was still open. Christine's family still had no answer, and somewhere in the evidence was biological material that had survived the decades. The significance of that evidence would only become clear as forensic science advanced. In 1984, investigators could not use DNA in the way modern investigators could. The technology available decades later was radically different. Genetic genealogy offered a new possibility. Instead of asking only whether a DNA profile directly matched someone already in a police database, investigators could examine genetic relationships and use family connections to narrow an unknown person down through generations. It was not a simple search. It was not a magic button. Investigators emphasized that genetic genealogy could provide a potential family lineage, after which detectives still had to reconstruct the family tree, eliminate possibilities, and obtain independent confirmation. In Christina's case, the process eventually led investigators toward Calvin Hoover, a Toronto man who had been 28 years old in 1984. And this was where the case took its most disturbing turn. Hoover was not a stranger from some distant city. Police said he was known to the Jessup family. He and his wife had a neighbor or acquaintance relationship with them, and members of the families had social connection. Christine's brother later said the Hoover family had attended barbecues and other family gatherings, and Hoover was even among those involved in the search for Christine after she disappeared. The person eventually identified through the DNA investigation had once existed within the broader circle of people around the family. That fact did not, by itself, establish what had happened in 1984, but it made the revelation profoundly unsettling. The mystery was no longer about an unknown face somewhere in the world. Police had identified a specific man whose biological material was connected to the crime, and investigators believed the evidence established that he was responsible. Yet Calvin Hoover could never stand before a judge. He had died in 2015. Toronto police said that if he were alive, he would have been arrested and charged with Christine Jessup's murder. Investigators obtained authorization to access a DNA sample associated with his autopsy, and that sample became the critical confirmation. The biological evidence from Christina's clothing could finally be compared against Hoover's DNA. The match transformed a decades-old mystery into an identification. On October 9th, SIL 2020, investigators confirmed the identification, and on October 15th, Toronto police publicly announced Hoover's name. 36 years after Christine disappeared, the case had finally reached an answer that investigators in 1984 could not have imagined, but an answer is not the same as closure. Christine was still dead. Her family had still endured decades without knowing who had taken her. Guy Paul Morin had spent years carrying the consequences of an accusation that DNA eventually proved false, and the announcement immediately created another question. How had the investigation missed Hoover in the first place? Reports after the identification raised the disturbing fact that Hoover apparently had not been interviewed during the original investigation, despite information indicating that people close to the family could have had access to the Jessup home. One report stated that police had questioned Hoover's wife shortly after Christine disappeared, but apparently did not interview Calvin Hoover himself. The implications were enormous. A man later identified through DNA had existed within the orbit of the victim's family, yet investigators had not identified him as the person responsible. Instead, the investigation had turned toward Morin, creating a chain of events that would damage an innocent man's life and leave Christine's real killer unidentified for decades. The case became more than a murder mystery. It became a warning about the danger of tunnel vision, the fragility of eyewitness interpretation, the limitations of forensic science, and the consequences of investigators becoming convinced they have found the answer before the evidence truly supports it. The years passed. Technology changed. People aged. Memories faded. Records disappeared into archives. Christine remained 9 years old forever, while everyone around her grew older. Her family carried the unanswered question through birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary days that should have been filled with memories of the woman Christine might have become. Then, decades later, a fragment of biological evidence spoke again. It did not speak in a voice. It did not reveal a motive. It did not reconstruct every minute of October 3rd, still 1984. It did something more precise. It pointed investigators toward a person, and that person was no longer alive. The irony was devastating. The case had finally produced a name, but there would be no courtroom confrontation, no cross-examination, no sentence, and no opportunity for a jury to hear the full evidence. There could only be an official conclusion from investigators and a family forced to absorb an answer that had arrived 36 years too late. Toronto police described the identification as an important step forward rather than a victory. More questions remained. Investigators wanted information about Hoover's life, his movements, and his possible connection to other incidents. After the announcement, police received more than 60 new tips from members of the public. The cold case had suddenly become active again, not because the killer was alive and facing arrest, but because investigators were trying to reconstruct the missing pieces of a story that had remained incomplete since 1984. And at the center of it all was Christine Jessup, a 9-year-old girl whose disappearance had once frozen an entire community. Her case had produced one of the most painful wrongful convictions in Canadian history, and then, decades later, one of the clearest demonstrations of how modern forensic science can reach backward through time. The evidence had survived. The technology eventually caught up with it. The truth had been buried for 36 years, but it had not disappeared. Somewhere inside an old piece of clothing, inside a preserved biological sample, inside genealogical connections scattered across generations, the investigation had been waiting. The killer was finally named. The innocent man was finally cleared beyond doubt. But the silence surrounding Christine's final hours could never be completely broken. And that is what makes the case so haunting. A little girl vanished in 1984. A nation searched for answers. An innocent neighbor was convicted. DNA overturned that conviction. Years became decades. Then genetic genealogy reached across time and identified Calvin Hoover. The case was no longer unsolved, but justice, arriving 36 years late, carried a terrible reminder with it. Sometimes the truth does not disappear. Sometimes it simply waits for science to become capable of finding it. By the time investigators publicly identified Calvin Hoover in October 2020, the name had already carried an unbearable weight through the Jessup family for decades because Christine had not disappeared from a world of strangers. She had disappeared from a community where people knew one another, where neighbors crossed paths, where children could walk familiar roads, and families could gather without imagining that someone nearby might be capable of unimaginable violence. That ordinary setting would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Christine Jessup was 9 years old in 1984. She was still a child. Her life was defined by school, family, friends, and the routines that make childhood feel permanent. Nothing about October 3rd suggested that the day would become the dividing line between the life Christine had lived and the nightmare that followed. When she went to a local store that afternoon, she was doing something completely ordinary. She bought bubble gum and began making her way home. Then she disappeared. The first hours were filled with uncertainty. A child not returning home could mean many things. Perhaps she had stopped somewhere. Perhaps she was visiting someone. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, but as time passed, fear began replacing hope. The search widened. Police and volunteers looked through the surrounding area. Christine's photograph was circulated. The public was asked to help. Every possible explanation had to be considered because there was no immediate evidence telling investigators exactly what had happened. The most frightening possibility was also the one that eventually proved true. Christine had been taken. More than 2 months later, on December 31st, Sill 1984, her body was found in a field near Sunderland, Ontario. The discovery transformed the missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. Christine had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. The brutality of the crime shocked the community, but the investigation itself would soon become almost as complicated as the crime. Police had to work backward from a body discovered far from the place where Christine had last been seen. They had to determine where she had been taken, who had encountered her, how she had been transported, and why the killer had chosen her. In an investigation involving a child, every detail could matter. Every person who had seen Christine could potentially become a witness. Every neighbor could potentially become a source of information. Every object recovered from the scene might contain evidence. But investigations are conducted by human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. In Christine's case, one of the most consequential mistakes was the growing focus on her neighbor, Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived near the Jessup family, and investigators eventually became convinced that he had something to do with Christine's disappearance and murder. The theory gained strength as investigators interpreted evidence through the lens of their suspicion. Morin was arrested in 1985. The case against him moved forward, and in 1986, he was convicted of Christine's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. For the Jessup family, the conviction seemed to offer an answer. For investigators, it appeared to close the circle around a suspect. For the public, a horrifying mystery seemed to have a solution. But the certainty was false. Morin maintained his innocence. The legal battle continued. His conviction was eventually overturned, and he was tried again. In the second trial, the prosecution again attempted to prove that Morin was responsible. He was convicted a second time in 1992, despite the absence of reliable evidence establishing that he was the killer. Then science intervened. DNA testing provided what the earlier investigation could not: a way to compare biological evidence associated with the crime directly against Morin's genetic profile. The result was devastating to the prosecution's theory. The DNA did not belong to Morin. In 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal acquitted him, and the wrongful conviction became a landmark case in Canadian criminal justice. Morin had spent years in prison for a murder he did not commit. The real killer remained free. The significance of that moment went far beyond the courtroom. It meant that investigators had been wrong. The man they had pursued had not been responsible, and the biological evidence connected to Christine's murder still belonged to someone whose identity remained unknown. That evidence would become the thread connecting 1984 to 2020. But the technology required to exploit that thread did not yet exist. DNA profiling was already changing criminal investigations in the 1990s, but genetic genealogy represented another leap. Traditional forensic DNA databases work, comparing an unknown profile against known profile. If the killer's DNA is not already represented, the search may produce nothing. Genetic genealogy changes the question. Instead of asking, "Whose DNA is this?" investigators can sometimes ask, "What family does this DNA appear to belong to?" That distinction can transform an apparently impossible case. In Christine's investigation, the biological material preserved from the original evidence eventually became suitable for advanced analysis. Investigators worked with modern forensic specialists and genealogical techniques to search for distant genetic relationships. The process was painstaking. A genetic match does not automatically identify a murderer. It can lead investigators toward relatives, then toward family trees, then toward a group of possible individuals. Each branch has to be examined. Each person must be evaluated against age, location, opportunity, and other evidence. Investigators cannot simply look at a genealogical connection and declare a suspect guilty. They have to build a case. In Christine's case, the genealogical trail eventually led to the Hoover family. Calvin Hoover had been 28 years old when Christine disappeared. He lived in Toronto and, according to investigators and people close to the case, was not an unknown figure in the Jessup family's wider social environment. That detail would later become particularly painful for Christine's relative. The case had spent decades searching for a mysterious outsider, yet the person ultimately identified through DNA had been close enough to the family's social orbit that his presence did not necessarily appear suspicious at the time. Investigators learned that Hoover's wife had been interviewed after Christine disappeared, but available reporting indicates that Calvin Hoover himself had not been interviewed during the original investigation. That omission became one of the most haunting facts to emerge after his identification. In a case where investigators had questioned people around Christine, why had the man eventually identified as her killer escaped attention? The answer lies partly in the limitations and assumptions of the original investigation. In 1984, there was no modern DNA database capable of instantly identifying a biological perpetrator. Investigators had to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, interviews, and traditional forensic methods. And once suspicion began concentrating on Moran, evidence that might have pointed elsewhere was interpreted within an increasingly narrow framework. That is the danger investigators later confronted when examining the case. The evidence did not necessarily change overnight. The interpretation changed. The DNA connected to Christine had been there all along. What changed was science. What changed was the ability to ask a different question, and what changed was the willingness to reopen a case that had already consumed decades of investigative effort. When investigators eventually obtained DNA associated with Hoover after his death in 2015, the comparison produced the answer they had been seeking. Hoover's DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing. Police concluded that Hoover was responsible for Christine's murder, but the identification created an unusual situation. The suspect was dead. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no courtroom, no cross-examination, no opportunity to ask him what happened on October 3rd, SIL 1984. Investigators could establish the identity through forensic evidence, but they could not recover the missing minutes of Christine's final journey. They could not hear Hoover explain his action. They could not determine every detail of the crime through his testimony. And they could not give Christine's family the kind of justice they had imagined for 36 years. Instead, they gave them something different, an answer that was both enormous and painfully incomplete. When Toronto police announced Hoover's identification, the news spread quickly. The case that had once symbolized investigative failure had suddenly become an example of forensic persistence. The revelation also brought back memories of the original investigation and the damage caused by Morin's wrongful conviction. For Morin, the identification of Hoover provided final confirmation that the man who had been convicted twice was not responsible. But no announcement could return the years he lost. No forensic breakthrough could erase the psychological and personal consequences of being branded a child murderer. The case therefore became two stories intertwined: the murder of Christine Jessup and the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. Both stories were consequences of the same investigation. Both were shaped by the evidence investigators had available, and both demonstrated how high the cost of investigative error can become. Yet even after Hoover's identification, one mystery remained more powerful than any DNA match. What exactly happened to Christine after she left the store? Somewhere between that ordinary afternoon and the field where her body was discovered, a sequence of events unfolded that only one person may have known in full. The forensic evidence could identify the perpetrator, but it could not reconstruct every moment. The public could finally attach a name to the crime, but the silence surrounding Christine's final hours remained. And that silence was made even more haunting by the fact that the man investigators identified had once been close enough to the Jessup family's world to appear during the frantic search for Christine. He was there, part of the environment surrounding the investigation, while the real killer remained hidden in plain sight. 36 years later, science finally pulled him out of the shadows. But by then, the community had changed. The family had aged. The innocent man had spent years fighting for his freedom, and Christine had remained frozen in memory as the 9-year-old girl whose ordinary trip for bubblegum became the beginning of one of Canada's most enduring murder mysteries. The cold case had finally produced a name, but the deeper tragedy was that the name had come far too late. The most disturbing feature of the Christine Jessup investigation was not simply that a child had been murdered, nor that the killer remained unidentified for 36 years, but that the investigation itself had already passed through one of the most painful failures imaginable. An innocent man had been convicted of the crime. When Guy Paul Moran walked out of prison after his acquittal in 1995, the official story surrounding Christine's murder had collapsed. But the crime itself remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, unanswered and unresolved. Christine was still dead, her killer was still free, and the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation was still waiting for science to catch up with it. For years, the case existed in that uncomfortable space between memory and uncertainty. The name of Guy Paul Moran could no longer be attached to Christine's murder. But there was no replacement. Investigators had no confirmed perpetrator. The original crime scene was decades old. Witnesses' memories had aged. People who might once have remembered small details had moved away, died, or simply forgot. The community around Queensville had changed. The little girl whose photograph had once appeared across Canada had become an adult in the memories of those who had known her. But she herself remained permanently 9 years old. Her family had lived through the unbearable contradiction of knowing that Christine's killer was somewhere in the world while having no way to identify him. The case became part of Canadian criminal history, but for the Jessup family, it was not history. It was personal. Every anniversary carried the same unanswered question. Who took Christine? Why her? How did she end up miles from home? And how had the person responsible managed to escape identification for so long? The breakthrough did not come because a forgotten witness suddenly walked into a police station with a confession. It did not come because an old suspect made a mistake. It came because investigators returned to evidence that had survived from 1984 and applied technology that did not exist when Christine was alive. The science of forensic genetics had changed dramatically. DNA profiling could now reveal information that investigators of the 1980s could not have imagined. More importantly, genetic genealogy had demonstrated its ability to generate leads in cases where conventional database searches had failed. Investigators could potentially take an unidentified DNA profile and search for distant relatives through genealogical databases, then use those connections to construct family trees. That approach had already attracted enormous attention in criminal investigations around the world. But it also required extraordinary patience. A distant genetic connection could lead to dozens, sometimes hundreds of relatives. Investigators had to separate the relevant branch from the irrelevant ones. They had to determine where people lived, when they lived there, who their relatives were, and whether a particular person could have been connected to the crime. In Christine's case, the process eventually pointed toward the Hoover family. That development was extraordinary because it did something that decades of traditional investigation had failed to accomplish. It narrowed an unknown genetic profile to a particular family. From there, investigators identified Calvin Hoover as the person whose DNA ultimately matched the biological evidence associated with Christine's murder. Hoover had been 28 in 1984. He was living in Toronto, and according to reporting surrounding the case, his family had a connection to the Jessup. That connection made the eventual revelation especially painful. The mystery had always carried the image of an unknown predator appearing from nowhere, but the truth investigators eventually established was more unsettling. The man identified as Christine's killer was not some completely invisible figure outside the community's awareness. He had been within its wider social orbit. He had interacted with people connected to Christine's family. He had participated in the search for her after she disappeared, and yet nothing about his involvement in that search immediately revealed the truth. Imagine the atmosphere in those first days after Christine vanished. Her photograph circulated, volunteers searched fields and roads, police questioned people, family members waited for news. Every person who joined the search could have been motivated by concern, fear, sympathy, or the simple desire to help. There was no obvious way to distinguish the person looking for Christine because he wanted to help from someone who might have known more than he was saying. That is one reason the later identification was so shocking. Hoover's presence during the search did not mean investigators should automatically have recognized him as the perpetrator. Hindsight can make missed opportunities look obvious. In reality, investigators in 1984 did not possess the information available decades later. They did not have the genetic evidence that eventually pointed toward Hoover. They did not know that the biological material preserved from the crime scene would one day identify a specific man. They were working inside a completely different technological world. But the case also revealed the danger of investigative tunnel vision. Once investigators became convinced that Morin was responsible, the investigation increasingly revolved around proving that theory. Morin's arrest and conviction demonstrated how powerful that process could become. Evidence was interpreted through suspicion, and suspicion became certainty. Then DNA shattered the certainty. That scientific reversal became one of the most important lessons of the case. The DNA did not merely identify someone else. It proved that the man investigators had convicted was not the source of the biological evidence. Science forced the investigation to begin again. But beginning again did not mean starting from nothing. The evidence collected in 1984 still existed. That was crucial. The killer had left behind something biological, something microscopic, something invisible to the naked eye, but potentially capable of carrying his identity across decades. For years, that evidence had been unable to answer the central question. Then forensic science changed the question itself. Instead of searching only for a direct database match, investigators could investigate biological relationships. The unknown DNA profile became a family clue. Somewhere in that genetic network was a connection leading toward Calvin Hoover. Investigators then had to independently verify the lead. Hoover had died in 2015, meaning there was no living suspect available for a conventional arrest. But his death did not prevent investigators from obtaining DNA for comparison. Police were able to obtain a sample associated with his autopsy, allowing the forensic comparison that ultimately confirmed the genetic connection. That moment represented a collision between two eras. Christine had disappeared in an age before modern DNA databases. Hoover had died before investigators publicly identified him, yet biological evidence from 1984 survived long enough to connect the two men, or rather the victim and the killer, across 36 years. When police announced the identification in October 2020, the language surrounding the case changed immediately. Christine Jessup was no longer simply the victim of an unsolved murder. Investigators could finally name the person they believed responsible. But the announcement also reopened painful memories of the original investigation. Guy Paul Morin had been wrongly accused. He had been convicted twice. He had spent years imprisoned. His name had become associated with a crime he did not commit. The eventual identification of Hoover could not undo those years. It could, however, establish beyond the shadow of the old prosecution theory that the investigation had pursued the wrong man. Morin's story became inseparable from Christine's. Two lives had been devastated by the same crime in different ways. Christine lost her future. Morin lost years of his own. The real perpetrator died without ever facing a courtroom, and the family waited decades for an answer. Even the final identification left an enormous gap. DNA could establish identity, but it could not tell Christine's family everything they wanted to know. It could not provide a complete account of Christine's final hour. It could not explain the motive in a way that would make the crime comprehensible. It could not reveal what Hoover was thinking when Christine vanished. And because Hoover was dead, investigators could never question him. The mystery therefore changed rather than disappeared. The central question of who killed Christine Jessup had an answer, but why and what exactly happened remained questions marked by silence. That distinction matters. A cold case can be solved in the investigative sense without every detail of the crime being recovered. For the Jessup family, an identified killer was profoundly significant, but it could never restore the years lost to uncertainty. The announcement also generated renewed public interest and new information. police received tips after the identification and continued examining the circumstances surrounding the murder. Investigators were interested in learning more about Hoover's life and whether people who knew him could provide information that might help reconstruct the events of 1984. 36 years had created enormous distance, but it had not erased the possibility that someone remembered something. A conversation, a location, a strange statement, an unexplained absence, a detail dismissed decades earlier that might look different now. That is, the peculiar nature of cold case investigations. Time can destroy evidence, but it can also change the meaning of evidence that survived. A detail that seemed irrelevant in 1984 can become significant after a suspect is identified. A person who was never considered important can suddenly become central. A photograph can acquire new meaning. A forgotten relationship can become a crucial link, and a tiny biological trace can become stronger than thousands of pages of speculation. For Christine's family, the discovery of Hoover's identity must have carried conflicting emotions. There was the relief of finally knowing. There was the horror of knowing who had been responsible. There was the anger surrounding the decades of uncertainty. There was the knowledge that an innocent man had suffered because investigators had reached the wrong conclusion. And there was the cruel fact that the person identified as Christine's killer was already dead. No trial could ever publicly reconstruct the crime. No judge could pronounce a sentence. No jury could hear the evidence. There would be no dramatic courtroom moment when the accused finally faced Christine's family. Instead, the truth arrived through forensic science, quietly and clinically after decades of silence. That may be one of the most haunting elements of the entire case. The breakthrough did not arrive with a confession. It arrived with a DNA comparison. A genetic signature preserved from the violence of 1984 had crossed time itself. It had survived an investigation that went wrong, a wrongful conviction, an acquittal, decades of uncertainty, and the death of the man ultimately identified as Christine's killer. And when the evidence finally spoke clearly enough, it did not simply point to a stranger. It pointed toward a man who had once existed within the same broader world as the family searching desperately for a missing child. That realization transformed the meaning of everything that had happened before. The search teams, the interviews, the accusations, the courtroom, the exoneration, the years of silence, all of it now belonged to a single chain of events stretching from a quiet October afternoon in 1984 to a forensic breakthrough in 2020. But the most painful question remained untouched by technology. What happened to Christine between the moment she disappeared and the moment investigators found her body? That answer was buried with the man police identified. And unlike DNA, memory cannot be extracted from a grave. For 36 years, the murder of Christine Jessup existed in the space between what investigators knew and what they could prove, and that distinction would shape everything that followed. The public knew Christine had disappeared. The police knew she had been found dead. They knew forensic evidence had been recovered. They knew an innocent man had once been convicted. But none of those facts could answer the question that haunted the investigation from the beginning. Who had taken a 9-year-old girl from her ordinary afternoon and carried her into a nightmare from which she would never return? When Christine disappeared on October 3rd, still 1984, the first assumption had not been murder. That is, an important detail because missing person investigations begin with uncertainty. A child may have gone to a friend's house. A child may have taken a different route home. A child may have become frightened or lost. But as the hours passed without Christine returning, those ordinary possibilities became harder to accept. Her family and the community began searching. Police became involved. The disappearance quickly became a major investigation. The search was not limited to one street or one neighborhood. People looked through surrounding areas trying to find any sign of the missing girl. Christine's image reached far beyond Queensville. Her disappearance became a national story, and the longer she remained missing, the more frightening the possibilities became. Then, on the final day of 1984, the uncertainty ended in the most devastating way possible. Christine's body was found in a field near Sunderland. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. The discovery provided investigators with physical evidence, but it also created an enormous investigative challenge. Christine had disappeared from one location and been found dead many kilometers away. Somewhere between those 2 points was the crime itself. The killer had somehow taken her from the world she knew, transported her away from home, and left her body where it could eventually be discovered. The question became one of reconstruction. Investigators needed to understand Christine's final movements. They needed to determine who could have approached her, who could have gained her trust, who had access to transportation, and who might have had knowledge of the area where her body was found. Every possibility mattered, yet the investigation soon developed a particular direction. Guy Paul Morin, Christine's neighbor, came under suspicion. Morin's proximity to the Jessup family made him a logical person for investigators to examine, but proximity alone was not proof. The investigation needed evidence capable of establishing his involvement beyond reasonable doubt. Instead, the case gradually became a demonstration of how suspicion can grow until it begins to shape the interpretation of everything around it. Morin was arrested in 1985. The prosecution presented a case that persuaded a jury, and Morin was convicted. The conviction seemed to provide the ending that investigators and the public had been waiting for. But behind the appearance of certainty was a fundamental problem. The biological evidence associated with the murder did not belong to Morin. At the time of his conviction, the significance of that fact could not be understood with the precision that later DNA testing would provide. Modern forensic genetics had not yet transformed criminal investigation. Investigators were still relying heavily on traditional forms of evidence, and forensic science had limitations that would become painfully obvious years later. Morin's conviction did not end the story. It created another chapter. He continued to insist he was innocent. His legal team challenged the conviction. Eventually, the case returned to court. Morin was tried again and convicted again in 1992. The second conviction was a devastating moment because it appeared to reinforce the original conclusion to juries had now accepted the prosecution's case. To the public, repeated conviction could appear to mean certainty, but science does not care how many times a theory has been repeated. When DNA testing became available, the evidence could be examined in a way that was impossible during the original proceeding. The biological material associated with Christine's murder was compared with Morin's genetic profile. It did not match. That result destroyed the central premise of the prosecution's case. In 1995, Morin was acquitted. The wrongful conviction became a defining example of the dangers of tunnel vision and flawed investigative reasoning. The acquittal also created a terrifying realization. If Morin had not killed Christine, then the real killer had never been caught. For the Jessup family, the nightmare had returned to its original state. The man convicted of murdering Christine was innocent, but the person who actually murdered her remained unidentified. Somewhere, potentially within the wider community, potentially far beyond it, was the person whose biological evidence had been left behind. The case became cold. Years passed. The investigation no longer dominated the daily news. The public moved on to other tragedies and other headlines, but the Jessup family did not have that luxury. Christine's absence remained permanent. There would be no adulthood to remember, no career to discuss, no marriage, no children, no ordinary photographs from later decades. Every future Christine might have had existed only in imagination. Meanwhile, forensic science continued advancing. DNA databases expanded. Genetic research became more sophisticated. Investigators began exploring methods that could connect unidentified crime scene DNA to distant relatives. Genetic genealogy emerged as one of the most powerful new tools in cold case investigation. It offered something traditional DNA matching could not always provide. If a suspect's DNA was not already in a law enforcement database, investigators might still find relatives through genealogical databases and work backward through family relationships. It was not a direct identification. It was a map, and somewhere on that map, investigators searching for Christine's killer eventually found a path toward Calvin Hoover. Hoover was born decades before Christine and was 28 when she disappeared. He lived in Toronto and had a connection to the Jessup family's wider social environment. That connection would later make the identification particularly disturbing. According to reporting following the breakthrough, Hoover's wife had been interviewed after Christine disappeared, but Calvin himself apparently had not been interviewed during the original investigation. The significance of that fact became clearer only after investigators identified him decades later. At the time of the original investigation, there was no reason for investigators to know that Hoover's DNA would eventually be linked to the crime. His presence in the search for Christine would not have automatically made him suspicious. He could appear to be exactly what he seemed, another person in the community responding to the disappearance of a child. But hindsight changes the emotional meaning of such details. Once investigators knew Hoover was the man whose DNA matched the evidence, every earlier connection became unsettling. The search for Christine suddenly contained an element that nobody had recognized. The killer had apparently been close enough to the broader social circle to participate in the response to the disappearance. The case therefore became a lesson in the limits of human perception. People often imagine that dangerous criminals must look suspicious, behave strangely, or stand apart from ordinary society. Reality is rarely so simple. A person can appear helpful while concealing an unimaginable secret. A neighbor can become a suspect only decades later. A familiar face can become terrifying when evidence changes the meaning of past events. But even after genetic genealogy pointed investigators toward Hoover, police still needed confirmation. A genealogical lead was not enough. Investigators obtained access to DNA associated with Hoover following his death in 2015. The forensic comparison provided the critical link. His genetic profile matched the biological evidence connected with Christine's murder. The cold case had finally produced an identification. Toronto police announced the breakthrough in October 2020, 36 years after Christine disappeared. But because Hoover had died 5 years earlier, investigators could not arrest him. The man whose identity had been hidden for decades could not be brought into a courtroom. He could not be interrogated. He could not explain himself. He could not challenge the evidence. He could not tell Christine's family why. All that remained was the evidence and the conclusion drawn from it. The announcement was therefore both historic and painfully incomplete. For Guy Paul Moran, it meant the final collapse of any lingering suspicion. For the Jessup family, it finally gave them a name. For investigators, it demonstrated the extraordinary power of modern forensic technology. But for everyone involved, it also forced a difficult question. Could anything truly compensate for 36 years of uncertainty? Christine's family had waded through an investigation that pointed at the wrong man, through a conviction that had to be overturned, through years when the case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. The breakthrough did not erase those years. It simply illuminated them. It showed how much time had been lost and how much had been at stake. The most painful irony was that the evidence had existed from the beginning. The DNA did not suddenly appear in 2020. It had been connected to the crime since 1984. What changed was humanity's ability to read it. The biological trace that once represented little more than forensic material became, decades later, a genetic key. That key opened a door investigators had been unable to unlock in the 1980s and 1990s. Behind that door was a name, Calvin Hoover. But behind the name was still darkness. DNA could tell investigators whose biological material was present. It could establish a critical connection between Hoover and the crime. It could help identify the person responsible. What it could not do was restore the missing narrative. It could not tell Christine's family every word spoken during her final hours. It could not explain the motive with certainty. It could not reveal what Hoover did after the murder or why he believed he could remain hidden. And because he died before the identification, there would never be a confession to complete the story. The cold case had been solved in one sense, but the silence surrounding Christine's final moments remained absolute. That silence would become the final and most haunting boundary of the investigation. Science could reach backward through 36 years and recover a name, but it could not reach into the mind of a dead man and recover the truth he had taken with him. The name Calvin Hoover changed the Christine Jessup investigation forever, but it did not erase the years that came before it. For investigators in 2020, the identification represented a major breakthrough. For Christine's family, it was an answer that had been delayed for 36 years. For Guy Paul Moran, it was another confirmation of what DNA had already established decades earlier. He had not murdered Christine. And for the investigators who reopened the cold case, the discovery created a new responsibility. They now had a name, but they needed to understand the man behind it. On October 15th, SIL 2020, Toronto police publicly confirmed that Hoover had been identified as the person responsible for the DNA found on Christine's underwear. Police stated that Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984, that he was known to the Jessup family at the time of Christine's disappearance, and that he had died in 2015. Police Chief James Raymer made something very clear during the announcement. If Hoover were alive, investigators would arrest him for Christine's murder. But Hoover was not alive. There would be no arrest. There would be no interrogation. There would be no trial. Instead, detectives were left with a different kind of investigation, one that required them to reconstruct the life and movements of a dead man more than 3 decades after the crime. They needed the public's memory. They needed photographs. They needed old relationships, old routines, old workplaces, old addresses, and anything else that could help establish Hoover's whereabouts around October 3rd, SIL 1984. Police specifically appealed for information that could help create a timeline of Hoover's movements and Christine's final moments. The appeal was striking because investigators were no longer asking the public to identify an unknown killer. They had the name. They were asking people to help explain the circumstances surrounding a crime whose central suspect could no longer speak. That distinction transformed the nature of the case. The first investigation had searched for a murderer. The final investigation was trying to reconstruct a history, and history is difficult to recover when 36 years have passed. People remember events differently. Details disappear. Old documents become difficult to locate. Relationships change. Memories become mixed with information learned later, yet investigators believe that someone, somewhere, might still remember Calvin Hoover. A photograph released by police showed him in the late 1990s, years after Christine's murder, but still close enough to the period that people who knew him might recognize him. Police hoped the photograph would trigger memories. Someone might remember where he worked. Someone might remember where he lived. Someone might remember conversations. Someone might remember an unusual event around the time Christine disappeared. A seemingly insignificant detail could potentially become important once Hoover's identity was known. This is one of the strange realities of cold case investigations. Before a suspect is identified, investigators search for clues without knowing which details will matter. After the suspect is identified, old information can suddenly acquire a completely different meaning. A person once considered irrelevant can become central. A routine trip can become significant. A relationship that seemed ordinary can suddenly appear in a different light. But investigators also have to guard against hindsight. Knowing the outcome can create the illusion that the answer was obvious all along. In reality, it was not. In 1984, Calvin Hoover was not identified as the killer. The biological evidence could not produce his name. Genetic genealogy did not yet exist as the investigative tool it would later become. Investigators were working without the technological advantage that eventually solved the case, and the investigation was already moving in another direction. Guy Paul Moran had become the focus. That decision would have consequences lasting decades. Moran was Christine's next-door neighbor. The proximity made him an obvious person to investigate, but suspicion is not evidence. Yet once investigators focused on Moran, the case began to acquire a narrative around him. The prosecution eventually persuaded a jury that he was responsible. Moran was convicted of first-degree murder in 1992 after a second trial, but the story did not end there. The DNA evidence that later exonerated him demonstrated how dangerous the earlier assumptions had been. The semen stains found on Christine's underwear came from a man who was not Moran. That scientific fact was devastating. It meant that the biological evidence was pointing somewhere else. The problem was that investigators did not yet know where. For years, the unknown DNA profile remained just that known. The evidence could exclude Moran, but it could not identify the person who had left it behind. That changed only after forensic technology developed enough to allow investigators to pursue genetic genealogy. The eventual identification of Hoover demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving original evidence. The material connected to Christine's murder had survived long enough for investigators to use a technological method unavailable in 1984. Without that preservation, the breakthrough might never have happened. The case therefore became a powerful example of why forensic evidence must be treated as something that may become more valuable with time. Scientific capabilities change. A sample that cannot answer a question today may answer it decades later. A test considered impossible in one generation can become routine in another. The evidence does not need to change. The technology does, and Christine's case was one of the clearest demonstrations of that principle. But the discovery also raised uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. Toronto police acknowledged that the case had a long and difficult history. The Morin prosecution had already been examined through a major public inquiry led by Justice Fred Coffey. That inquiry examined how the wrongful conviction happened and produced extensive recommendations aimed at preventing similar miscarriages of justice. The Federal Justice Department later described the Morin case as a powerful example of how DNA can exonerate an innocent person. The inquiry examined issues including the handling and interpretation of forensic evidence, investigative practices, and the dangers surrounding unreliable expert conclusions. The lesson was not simply that one investigator made one mistake. The problem was broader. Criminal investigations can become vulnerable when evidence is interpreted through assumptions that have already taken hold. Once a theory becomes dominant, information that supports it may receive more attention, while information that contradicts it may be discounted. That process can happen gradually, almost invisible. No single moment necessarily announces that an investigation has gone wrong. Instead, a series of small decisions can slowly narrow the field until investigators are no longer asking, "What happened?" but rather, "How can we prove what we believe happened?" The Christine Jessup case showed how dangerous that difference can be. The real killer remained unidentified while an innocent neighbor was convicted. Years later, the DNA evidence finally corrected the central mistake. But the correction came at a terrible cost. Morin had already lived through the consequences of being accused, convicted, and imprisoned. Christine's family had already endured decades without knowing who had killed her, and the person ultimately identified as the killer had died without ever facing the consequences of the crime in a courtroom. There would be no traditional ending. No judge would read a sentence. No jury would deliberate over the evidence. No prosecutor would stand before the court and explain every detail. Instead, the case ended through forensic identification and an official police conclusion. That kind of ending can feel incomplete, especially in a murder case involving a child. The word solved can sound almost too simple. What does solved mean when the killer is dead? What does justice mean when there can be no trial? What does closure mean when the family still does not know everything that happened? Police themselves acknowledged that the identification was not a moment for celebration. Chief Raymer said there were no winners in the announcement and that nothing could reverse the events of 36 years earlier. That statement captured the reality of the case. The breakthrough was important. It was historic. It was scientifically remarkable. But it was not a happy ending. There was no way to make October 3rd, SIL 1984, disappear. There was no way to return Christine to her family. There was no way to restore the years that had been lost. There was no way to give Morin back the years taken from him by a wrongful conviction. There was only the truth that had finally emerged, and even that truth was limited. Police knew who the biological evidence belonged to. They knew Hoover had been connected to the Jessup family. They knew he was 28 at the time of the murder. They knew he had died in 2015, but there were still questions about his movements and about the circumstances surrounding Christine's final hour. That was why investigators continued asking the public for information even after the DNA identification. They wanted a timeline. They wanted context. They wanted memories. They wanted to understand how Hoover fit into the events of October 1984. The appeal itself revealed something important. DNA had solved the question of identity, but not every question of history. The genetic evidence could say, in effect, that the biological material came from who. It could not tell investigators where he had been at every moment. It could not explain what he said. It could not reveal what he was thinking. It could not recreate the crime scene. And it could not provide the testimony that only a living suspect could have given. The person who might have answered those questions was gone. His death had closed the door on a confession that left investigators searching for fragments of information scattered among people who had known him. 36 years after Christine vanished, they were asking the same basic question in a new form. What happened? The difference was that now they knew whose life they needed to examine. The unknown man had become Calvin Hoover. The shadow had a face, but a face was not the whole story. The investigators still needed to understand the path from a 9-year-old girl's disappearance to the biological evidence that ultimately identified the killer. Somewhere in that path were the details that could explain the crime, and somewhere in the memories of the people who had known Hoover might be a piece of that missing timeline. The cold case had reached its most extraordinary point. After decades of uncertainty, science had finally produced the name. Now the investigation had to confront the question that DNA could not answer. What happened during those missing hours, and how had the man responsible remained hidden for so long? The identification of Calvin Hoover did something that no previous stage of the investigation had been able to accomplish. It transformed a faceless mystery into a human being, a person who had lived among other people, worked, spoken, traveled, attended gatherings, and existed inside an ordinary world while carrying a secret that would remain hidden for decades. But even after police identified him through DNA, the central mystery surrounding Christine Jessup remained painfully incomplete. Investigators could establish a biological connection. They could identify the man responsible. They could explain why Guy Paul Morin had been wrongly convicted. Yet they still could not reconstruct every moment between Christine's disappearance and the discovery of her body. The unanswered details were buried beneath 36 years of silence, and silence becomes more difficult to break as time passed. On October 3rd, still 1984, Christine had gone to a local store and purchased bubble gum. It was an ordinary act by an ordinary child, the kind of moment that normally disappears into the endless sequence of childhood memories. But Christine never made it home. Her disappearance triggered an enormous response because she was 9 years old and because there was no obvious explanation for where she had gone. Searchers looked for her. Police investigated. Her photograph spread through the media. The public waited for news. Every hour without an answer increased the fear. Eventually, investigators had to confront the possibility that Christine was no longer alive. That possibility became reality when her body was discovered on December 31st, still 1984, in a field near Sunderland. The distance between her home and the location where she was found immediately raised questions. How had she traveled there? Who had taken her? Was the killer familiar with the area? Had Christine known the person who approached her? Had the perpetrator deliberately chosen a location away from the community? Those questions would remain unresolved for decades. The original investigation attempted to answer them using the methods available at the time. Detectives interviewed people. They examined physical evidence. They developed theories. They followed leads. They focused on individuals who appeared connected to the crime, and eventually their attention centered on Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived next door to the Jessup family. That fact made him visible to investigators, but visibility is not guilt. The investigation nevertheless developed into a prosecution. Morin was arrested, tried, and convicted. The conviction became a source of apparent certainty in a case that had been defined by uncertainty. But the certainty did not survive scientific scrutiny. DNA testing ultimately excluded Morin and helped establish that the biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing belonged to another man. Morin was acquitted in 1995. The case that had once seemed solved was suddenly unsolved again. For Christine's family, the emotional impact must have been devastating. The man they had been told was responsible was innocent. The real killer was still somewhere beyond the reach of the investigation. The case returned to the cold case files, but the evidence did not disappear. The DNA profile remained. It was a silent identifier without a name. Investigators could compare it against available databases, but no direct match emerged. That meant the profile could exclude suspects, but could not identify the perpetrator. This is where the passage of time became strangely important. Usually, time is the enemy of an investigation. Witnesses forget. Evidence deteriorates. People die. Locations change. Records vanish. But in Christine's case, time also allowed forensic science to develop. The same DNA evidence that could not identify the killer in the 1990s became potentially powerful decades later. Genetic genealogy introduced a new investigative path. The technique could use distant genetic relationships to identify family connections and generate investigative leads. Instead of searching for the killer directly, investigators could search for people genetically related to the unknown profile. That process eventually pointed toward the Hoover family. The discovery was remarkable, but it was only the beginning of the final phase. Investigators needed to determine which member of the family could have been responsible. Calvin Hoover emerged as the person whose DNA ultimately matched the evidence. His identity was confirmed through comparison with DNA associated with his autopsy after his death in 2015. The match provided the forensic link police had been missing since 1984. 36 years after Christine disappeared, investigators finally knew who had left the biological evidence behind. Yet the breakthrough also created an unsettling realization about the original investigation. Hoover had not been an unknown figure living hundreds of kilometers away. He had been part of the broader social environment surrounding the Jessup family. His wife had been interviewed after Christine disappeared, while reporting on the case indicates that Calvin himself was not interviewed during the original investigation. Once that information became public, people naturally wondered how such an opportunity could have been missed. But the answer cannot be reduced to one overlooked interview. Investigators in 1984 did not know what later science would reveal. They did not have the genetic evidence capable of identifying Hoover. They were operating within the limits of their time, and their attention had already been drawn toward Moran. The case demonstrates how investigative focus can shape what detectives see. Once a suspect becomes central, investigators may unconsciously organize new information around that person. Evidence supporting the theory appears more significant. Evidence contradicting it may appear less important. Witness memories can become influenced by repeated questioning and expectation. The result can be a self-reinforcing theory that becomes increasingly difficult to challenge. Moran's wrongful conviction showed the devastating consequences of that process. The DNA that ultimately cleared him had existed as evidence, but the technology and interpretation necessary to understand it were not available in the same way. When science finally exposed the mismatch, the entire theory collapsed. But the true killer still remained unnamed. That is what makes the later genetic genealogy breakthrough so significant. It did not simply identify Hoover, it completed a forensic chain that had begun in 1984. The evidence recovered after Christine's murder survived long enough to become useful in an entirely different era of criminal investigation. It crossed from one technological generation to another. In the 1980s, biological evidence was something investigators could collect and preserve. In the 1990s, DNA could help overturn a wrongful conviction. In the 2000s and 2010s, genetic genealogy developed into a new method of identifying unknown suspects. By 2020, investigators could finally connect Christine's evidence to a specific man. That progression is almost impossible to understand without considering how rapidly forensic science changed. The crime itself had not changed. The evidence had not changed. The people involved had not changed. Only the ability to interpret the evidence had changed. And suddenly, after 36 years, the mystery had a name. But the name did not answer every question. Hoover was dead. Investigators could not question him about Christine. They could not ask whether he had watched her leave the store. They could not ask how he gained access to her. They could not ask where he took her. They could not ask why he chose her. They could not ask why he participated in the search after her disappearance. And they could not ask what he thought during the years when an innocent man was imprisoned for his crime. Those questions would remain unanswered unless someone else had information capable of filling the gap. That was why Toronto police continued appealing for information after announcing Hoover's identification. The public was asked to provide anything they remembered about Hoover. particularly information that could help investigators understand his movements around the time Christine disappeared. Investigators received dozens of tips following the announcement. Each tip represented a possibility. A person who remembered Hoover from 1984 might remember something investigators had never known. A photograph might reveal an association. An old document might establish a location. A forgotten acquaintance might remember a conversation, but there was another difficulty. Memory is not a recording. 36 years can alter the details of a person's recollections. Someone may confidently remember an event that occurred differently from how it actually happened. Another person may remember nothing until a photograph or a name suddenly unlocks an old memory. Investigators, therefore, had to treat every new piece of information carefully. The identification of Hoover did not give them permission to assume that every suspicious detail from his past was connected to Christine. They needed evidence. They needed corroboration. They needed to distinguish fact from hindsight. That discipline was particularly important because the case had already suffered from a catastrophic investigative error. The history of Guy Paul Morin meant investigators had a responsibility not to repeat the same mistake in a different form. Hoover's DNA match was powerful evidence, but investigators still had to separate what was established from what remained uncertain. What was established was the biological connection. What was established was Hoover's identity. What was established was that he had been 28 when Christine was murdered and that he had a connection to the Jessup family. What remained less clear was the full sequence of events. The murder itself had occurred in 1984, and the person investigators believed responsible was no longer available to explain it. That created a permanent boundary around the case. The forensic evidence could reach across time, but it could not recover a dead man's memories. And that boundary is where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable. Christine was 9. Her entire future was taken from her. Her family spent decades searching for answers. Morin spent years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The real killer lived for decades without being publicly identified. Then, in 2020, science finally exposed the truth, but justice arrived in an unusual form. It arrived without handcuffs, without a courtroom, without a sentence, without a confession. It arrived as a DNA match. The technology had finally spoken clearly enough to identify the man whose biological evidence had remained unknown since 1984. The case was no longer a mystery of identity. It had become a mystery of history, and the difference was enormous. The question was no longer simply, who killed Christine Jessup? The question was now, what can still be learned about the crime after 36 years? Every surviving memory mattered. Every surviving document mattered. Every preserved piece of evidence mattered. Because the killer was gone, the people left behind became the only possible bridge between the forensic conclusion and the missing story. And somewhere inside that gap was the final truth about Christine's last hours, a truth that DNA alone could never reveal. By the time investigators reached Calvin Hoover through genetic genealogy, the Christine Jessup case had already become a warning written into Canadian criminal history. A case where a 9-year-old girl was murdered, an innocent neighbor was convicted, DNA eventually overturned that conviction, and the true perpetrator remained unidentified for decades. But the discovery of Hoover's identity created another layer of questions because it forced investigators and the public to look backward at the original investigation with information nobody had possessed in 1984. Suddenly, details that had once seemed ordinary became impossible to ignore. Hoover had been 28 years old when Christine disappeared. He lived in Toronto. He was connected to the Jessup family's wider social circle. His wife had been interviewed during the original investigation, while available reporting indicates Calvin himself was not interviewed. And after Christine disappeared, Hoover was among the people who participated in the search. None of those facts alone could have revealed the truth at the time. But once DNA identified him, they became part of a much darker picture. That is, the strange power of a cold case. Time can bury evidence, but it can also change the meaning of evidence that survived. The original investigators had been looking for a killer without knowing his identity. Decades later, investigators were looking at the same history with a name attached to the biological evidence. The perspective had completely changed. In October 1984, the search for Christine was driven by uncertainty. She had left home, gone to a local store, and purchased bubble gum. Then she vanished. Her family did not know where she was. Neighbors did not know where she was. Police did not know where she was. The community responded with urgency because every hour mattered. Volunteers searched. Investigators questioned people. Christine's photograph circulated widely. The entire country eventually became familiar with the face of a missing 9-year-old girl. There was hope that she might still be found alive, but the discovery of her body on December 31st destroyed that hope. The case became a murder investigation, and the investigators now had to determine not only where Christine had been taken, but who had been responsible. The discovery of her body in a field near Sunderland created an immediate geographical puzzle. Christine had disappeared from the Queensville area, but her body was found many kilometers away. Someone had transported her. That meant the killer likely had access to transportation and knew where to leave the body. But there was no simple map leading investigators from Christine's last known location to the murder. The trail was fragmented. The evidence was incomplete. The investigation required detectives to make judgments under pressure, and gradually suspicion fell on Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived next door to the Jessup family. His proximity placed him close to the investigation, and investigators began examining his movements, statements, and relationship to the family. The suspicion eventually became an accusation. In 1985, Morin was arrested. The prosecution built its case, and he was convicted. But the conviction did not bring the truth. It brought another tragedy. Morin was innocent. The biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing came from another man. Years later, DNA testing would demonstrate that the evidence did not belong to Morin. His conviction was eventually overturned, and he was acquitted in 1995. But by then, the consequences were irreversible. An innocent man had spent years behind bars. The real killer had remained free, and Christine's family had lost even more time. The wrongful conviction became a national lesson in investigative tunnel vision. It demonstrated that investigators can become so convinced of a theory that the theory begins to determine how evidence is interpreted. Once Morin became the focus, the investigation's center of gravity shifted toward proving his involvement. The possibility that someone else had committed the crime remained, but it did not receive the same weight. The eventual DNA evidence exposed that failure. It did not merely show that Morin was innocent. It showed that the killer had left biological evidence that could potentially identify him. The challenge was that the technology of the time could not yet make that identification. The DNA profile remained anonymous. For years, it was simply the genetic signature of an unknown man. It could be compared against available records, but there was no direct match. Every unsuccessful search reinforced the idea that the killer might remain unidentified forever. Then forensic genealogy changed the equation. Investigators could use the unknown DNA profile to search for genetic relatives. The method required careful genealogical reconstruction. Distant matches could lead to branches of a family tree, and investigators could then identify possible candidates based on age, location, and other factors. Eventually, the trail led toward Calvin Hoover, but the discovery was not based on genealogy alone. Investigators still needed confirmation. Hoover had died in 2015, but police obtained a DNA sample associated with his autopsy. The comparison produced the decisive match. His DNA corresponded with the biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing. After 36 years, the identity of the killer had finally been established, yet the revelation was almost cruel in its timing. Hoover was already dead. He could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not be brought into court. The man who had carried the truth for decades had died 5 years before investigators could name him publicly. For Christine's family, that meant the answer arrived without the confrontation they might once have imagined. There was no trial where the evidence could be presented and challenged. There was no sentencing hearing. There was no final statement from the accused. Instead, there was a press conference and a name. Calvin Hoover. That name immediately forced the public to reconsider the social environment surrounding Christine's disappearance. According to reports, Hoover was not completely disconnected from the Jessup family. His wife had known the family. The two families had social contact. Hoover was among the people who joined the search after Christine disappeared. The implications were deeply disturbing. The killer, investigators concluded, had not simply vanished into another world after committing the crime. He had remained in the background while others searched for Christine. He had been close enough to the tragedy to participate in the community response. That does not mean every action during the search can be interpreted as evidence of guilt. But once his DNA was identified, the historical details became profoundly unsettling. The community had been searching for Christine while the person ultimately identified as her killer was apparently among those affected by the search itself. This is one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of the case. People often imagine that murder investigations separate the victim from the perpetrator by distance. In reality, that distance can be almost non-existent. A killer can live nearby. A killer can know the family. A killer can attend gatherings. A killer can appear sympathetic. The danger is not always visible. In Christine's case, the public did not know that the man they were eventually told was responsible was within the broader social environment surrounding the family, and investigators did not know either. That distinction matters because hindsight can create a false sense of inevitability. Once the name Hoover became public, it was tempting to look backward and ask why nobody had suspected him. But suspicion requires information. In 1984, investigators did not possess the DNA evidence that would later identify Hoover. They did not know that a preserved biological sample would eventually connect him to the murder. They were working in an era when forensic genetics was still developing. The breakthrough decades later was therefore not simply a matter of investigators finally asking the right question. It was a combination of preserved evidence, new technology, genealogical analysis, and renewed investigative attention. The original evidence had survived. That fact became crucial. Without preserved biological material, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to work with. The evidence from 1984 became a bridge between the past and the future. It survived the wrongful conviction. It survived Morin's exoneration. It survived years of investigative uncertainty, and it survived long enough for technology to turn it into an identification. The case demonstrated why cold case evidence can become more valuable over time rather than less. Scientific progress can transform the meaning of material that once appeared limited. In 1984, investigators could collect biological evidence but could not use it to create the kind of investigative lead that became possible decades later. By 2020, the same evidence could be subjected to advanced genetic analysis. That transformation changed everything. Yet the identification also reopened the question of how much remained unknown. Police publicly stated that Hoover was responsible for Christine's murder, but because he was dead, they could not question him. Investigators appealed for information from anyone who knew him, hoping to establish a timeline and reconstruct his activities around the time Christine disappeared. More than 60 tips were reportedly received following the announcement. Each tip represented a possible fragment of the missing story. Some might be irrelevant. Some might confirm facts investigators already knew. Others might provide a detail that had never been documented. Cold case detectives have to work with that uncertainty. They cannot assume that every memory is accurate, and they cannot treat every new claim as fact. The history of the case made caution even more important. Investigators had already seen what could happen when assumptions overpower evidence. The wrongful conviction of Morin was a permanent reminder. This time, the evidence was stronger. The DNA provided a direct forensic connection, but the remaining questions required a different kind of investigation. They required reconstruction. They required memory. They required context. And they required separating what was proven from what was merely possible. Christine's final hours remained the darkest part of the story. Investigators could identify the biological source, but they could not recreate every moment. They could not determine exactly what was said. They could not recover Christine's thoughts. They could not ask Hoover why he did what he did. Those answers had disappeared with him. Yet the identification still changed the case profoundly. For Christine's family, there was finally a name where there had been an empty space for Guy Paul Morin. there was further confirmation that the man who had once been convicted was not responsible. For Canadian investigators, there was a powerful demonstration of what modern forensic science could achieve when old evidence was preserved. And for the public, there was a disturbing realization that the person responsible had lived for decades without being publicly identified. 36 years had separated the crime from the breakthrough. A child had disappeared in 1984. A wrongful conviction had followed. An innocent man had fought to clear his name. The real killer had died. And then, long after the world had begun to believe that the truth might never be known, a genetic connection reached backward through time and exposed him. But even that extraordinary discovery could not answer the question that had haunted the Jessup family from the beginning. Why did Christine die? What happened during those final hours? And how did a 9-year-old girl's ordinary trip for bubblegum become the beginning of a crime that would remain embedded in Canadian memory for generations? Those questions remained beyond the reach of DNA. The evidence could identify the man. It could not resurrect the moment. And as investigators continued examining the information surrounding Hoover, the case entered its strangest phase yet. The killer had finally been named, but the final story of Christine Jessup still had pieces missing. The revelation of Calvin Hoover's identity did not arrive like the ending of a conventional murder investigation. There was no arrest at dawn, no police convoy, no handcuffs closing around the wrists of a suspect, no courtroom packed with reporters waiting for a verdict. Hoover had been dead since 2015. The man investigators identified through DNA could never be questioned about Christine Jessup, never confronted with the evidence, never asked to explain the decisions that had taken a 9-year-old girl's life. Instead, the truth emerged quietly from evidence that had survived for 36 years and that made the breakthrough both extraordinary and deeply unsettling. The biological material recovered during the original investigation had existed long before genetic genealogy became a tool capable of identifying an unknown person through distant family relationship. For decades, that evidence had effectively been a locked door. Then forensic science found the key, but opening the door revealed something investigators had not expected. The person behind the evidence was not merely a name from a distant database. He was Calvin Hoover, a man who had been 28 years old in 1984 and who, according to investigators and reporting surrounding the case, was connected to the Jessup family's broader social circle. That connection made the breakthrough feel even more disturbing because it challenged the image of the unknown killer as a complete outsider. Hoover had existed within a world familiar to Christine's family. His wife had been interviewed after Christine disappeared. Hoover himself was apparently not interviewed during the original investigation. He also participated in the search for Christine. These facts did not prove his guilt at the time. They became significant only after the DNA evidence identified him. That distinction is essential. Cold cases can create an illusion that the answer was always obvious. It was not. Investigators in 1984 did not have the information available to investigators in 2020. They were trying to solve a child's disappearance using the forensic tools, investigative techniques, and information available at the time, and they made a devastating mistake by focusing on Guy Paul Moran. Moran was not the killer. He was Christine's neighbor, and the investigation eventually built a case against him that resulted in conviction. His first conviction came in 1986. Years later, after his conviction was overturned, he was tried again and convicted in 1992. The second conviction made the failure even more painful because it demonstrated how strongly the original theory had taken hold. Yet DNA testing ultimately destroyed the case against him. The biological material associated with Christine's murder did not belong to Moran. In 1995, he was acquitted. The man who had been presented to the public as Christine's killer was innocent. The real killer remained unknown. The case had therefore entered a new era. Investigators knew that the DNA belonged to someone else, but they could not identify him. That profile became a silent witness. It could not speak, but it could exclude. It could establish that Moran was not responsible. It could potentially identify the killer if a matching profile ever appeared. But years passed without that match. Traditional DNA searches were limited by the databases available to investigators. If the killer had never been arrested for an offense that resulted in a usable DNA profile, the comparison could go nowhere. This is why genetic genealogy became so important. The technique did not require the unknown perpetrator to have already been arrested or cataloged in a criminal database. Instead, investigators could look for relatives. A genetic profile could reveal connections to people who shared portions of their DNA with the unknown individual. Those connections could then be mapped through family tree. The process could narrow the search from an unknown man to a particular family, then from a family to a particular individual. But the method was not instantaneous. It required investigators and genealogists to follow generations of relationships, verify identities, and eliminate people who could not have committed the crime. The eventual path toward Hoover was the product of that careful process. His name emerged from a network that had not been visible to investigators in the 1980s, and once investigators had identified him as a potential source of the DNA, they needed independent confirmation. That confirmation came from DNA associated with Hoover after his death. The comparison matched the biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing. The science was decisive. 36 years after the murder, investigators had the identity they had been missing since 1984. But science also exposed the limitations of what could be known. DNA can identify a person associated with biological evidence. It cannot necessarily reconstruct the entire crime. It cannot tell investigators every movement a person made. It cannot reveal motive. It cannot produce a confession from someone who is dead. And it cannot answer the questions that family members have carried for decades when the only person who knew the complete truth is no longer alive. For Christine's family, this distinction must have been profound. There was finally an answer to one of the most painful questions: who killed her? But there was no way to rewind the clock. There was no way to restore Christine's childhood, her adolescence, her adulthood, or the future she never experienced. There was no way to remove the trauma from the people who had spent decades searching for answers, and there was no way to erase the damage caused by the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. The case, therefore, became a story of multiple victims. Christine was the central victim, the child whose life was taken. Her family became victims of decades of uncertainty. Morin became a victim of a justice system that convicted him of a crime he did not commit. And even the broader community carried the consequences of a murder that had remained unresolved for more than a generation. When Toronto police announced Hoover's identification, they appealed to the public for information about him. Investigators wanted to understand his life around the time of Christine's murder. They wanted to establish a timeline. They wanted to know where he had been and whether anyone remembered interactions with him that could help explain the crime. More than 60 tips were received following the announcement, demonstrating that the identification had reopened memories that had been dormant for decades. People who had known Hoover might suddenly have recognized his name. Someone might have remembered an old conversation. Someone might have remembered seeing him in a particular location. Someone might have possessed an old photograph or document that could provide context. The police appeal was therefore not merely about proving what DNA had already established. It was about filling the empty spaces around it. That distinction is what makes cold case investigations so different from ordinary investigation. In a fresh case, detectives may have surveillance footage, recent phone records, fresh witness memories, intact crime scenes, and suspects who can be questioned. In a case 36 years old, those tools may be gone. Technology can compensate for some losses, but not all. DNA may survive. Memories may not. Documents may exist. People may not. A location may have changed completely. The challenge becomes one of assembling fragments, and the Christine Jessup investigation contained more fragments than most. There was the original disappearance. There was the discovery of Christine's body. There was the forensic evidence. There was the investigation of Morin. There were the trial. There was the DNA exoneration. There were years of unsuccessful attempts to identify the unknown male profile. There was the development of genetic genealogy. There was the identification of Hoover. Each event was connected, but each belonged to a different era. The case had effectively passed through several generations of investigative thinking. The first investigators were looking for a missing child. The next investigators were trying to prove a murder conviction. Later investigators were trying to correct a wrongful conviction. Finally, modern investigators were trying to identify a killer through genetics. The goal had changed repeatedly because the information had changed, and at every stage, the case exposed the limitations of what investigators could know. In 1984, they could not identify the DNA source. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, they pursued Moran. In the 1990s, DNA cleared him but left the killer unidentified. In the 2010 genetic genealogy offered a new path. In 2020, that path reached Calvin Hoover. The story was therefore not simply one of technology defeating time. It was also a story about evidence surviving human error. The original investigation had gone badly wrong, but the biological evidence had remained. It became the thread that eventually corrected the narrative. The evidence did not care about the theories investigators had built. It did not care about the convictions. It did not care about the passage of years. It simply remained there, waiting for a method capable of interpreting it. And when that method arrived, the result was devastatingly clear. Hoover's DNA matched the biological evidence connected to Christine. The mystery of identity was over. Yet one mystery remained almost untouched. What happened to Christine during the final hours of her life? Investigators knew she had disappeared on October 3rd. They knew her body was found on December 31st. They knew the forensic evidence connected Hoover to her murder. But the complete narrative between those points was not preserved in a living witness. The man who might have known every detail was dead. That left the investigators with evidence and memories, but no confession, and it left Christine's family with an answer that could never be complete. The phrase, "cold case solved," appeared in headlines, but the words could not capture the emotional complexity. A case can be solved while a family remains haunted. A killer can be identified while a motive remains unclear. A wrongful conviction can be overturned while the years lost to it remain lost forever. Justice can arrive without a courtroom. Truth can emerge without a confession. And sometimes the most powerful evidence in a case is not something discovered yesterday, but something that survived from the day the crime happened. Christine's story was ultimately a race against time, in which time seemed to win for decades. But the evidence survived. The DNA survived. The memory of Christine survived. And eventually, modern science reached backward and connected a biological trace from a 9-year-old girl's murder to a man whose name had remained hidden for 36 years. The discovery did not change what happened to Christine. It changed what the world could finally say about what happened. The killer was no longer an unknown figure. He had a name, Calvin Hoover. But the silence around Christine's final hours remained, and that silence would become the final frontier of a case that had already survived wrongful conviction, technological limitations, decades of uncertainty, and the death of the man investigators believed responsible. When Calvin Hoover's name finally became public, the Christine Jessup case entered a strange new reality. For 36 years, the question had been brutally simple. Who killed Christine? Now investigators had an answer, yet the answer did not arrive in the form families normally imagine when they hear the words, "cold case solved." There was no suspect sitting across an interrogation table. There was no arrest warrant being served at a front door. There was no courtroom where prosecutors could lay out the evidence and ask a jury to determine guilt. Hoover had died in 2015. By the time forensic genealogy and subsequent DNA testing connected him to Christine's murder, the man who could have provided the missing narrative was already beyond reach. What remained was evidence, memory, and a long trail of unanswered questions. For the Jessup family, the identification meant that one terrible uncertainty had finally ended. For Guy Paul Moran, it reinforced the scientific conclusion that had cleared him decades earlier. For investigators, it created the responsibility of reconstructing as much of the past as possible without falling into the same trap that had destroyed the original investigation. And for the public, it transformed a decades-old mystery into a story about how modern science could reach across generations and identify a killer who had escaped detection for more than 3 decades. But beneath the headlines was the same child, Christine Jessup, 9 years old. Gone from home on October 3rd, Sill 1984, her body discovered months later. Her life ended before she had the opportunity to become anything other than the little girl remembered in photographs from that time. The investigation had spent years trying to understand the circumstances of her disappearance, but the eventual DNA breakthrough revealed just how much of the original story had remained hidden. The biological evidence had been present since 1984. It was not newly discovered in 2020. It had simply become interpretable in a way that earlier investigators could not achieve. That difference is critical. Modern forensic science did not create the evidence. It unlocked it. The DNA profile had already existed. The unknown male had already left his genetic signature behind. What technology eventually provided was a path from that signature to a family, and from that family to Calvin Hoover. Genetic genealogy works by identifying genetic relationships between an unknown profile and people whose DNA is represented in genealogical databases. The result can be distant relatives rather than a direct match. Investigators then have to build family trees, trace relationships across generations, and narrow possible candidates using age, geography, and other circumstances. In Christine's case, that process ultimately led investigators towards Hoover. The identification was then independently supported by DNA obtained after his death. The biological material from Hoover matched the forensic evidence connected to Christine's murder. It was the kind of breakthrough investigators had been waiting for since the original DNA testing had cleared Morin, but the road to that moment had been filled with disappointment. After Morin's exoneration, the case remained open. The unidentified DNA profile was a clue without a name. It could establish that someone else had been involved, but it could not tell investigators who. Years passed. The profile remained unidentified. Then genetic genealogy changed the possibilities. Suddenly, an unknown offender did not necessarily have to be present in a criminal database. His relatives might be enough to begin the search. This was a profound change in investigative strategy. Instead of waiting for the killer to make another mistake, investigators could use the genetic information he had unknowingly left behind. The killer did not need to confess. He did not need to contact police. He did not need to appear in another investigation. His DNA could speak for him, and eventually it did. But the identification also forced investigators to confront the mistakes of the past. Paul Morin had been imprisoned because investigators and prosecutors had become convinced that he was responsible. The eventual DNA evidence proved otherwise. His exoneration became a landmark example of wrongful conviction, and the subsequent inquiry into the case examined how the justice system could fail when investigators become trapped by a theory. The problem was not simply that investigators had chosen the wrong person. The deeper problem was how evidence had been interpreted. Once Morin became the central suspect, information was evaluated through that assumption. The investigation had effectively begun to search for confirmation rather than continuing to test competing explanations with equal intensity. This is one of the most dangerous moments in any investigation. A theory can be useful because it gives investigators direction, but when a theory becomes certainty before the evidence warrants certainty, the investigation can become blind to alternatives. Christine's case demonstrated that danger in the most devastating possible way. The true killer remained unidentified while an innocent man was convicted, and because the real perpetrator had not been found, the danger did not end with Morin's acquittal. The case remained unresolved for decades. The identification of Hoover did not erase that history. Instead, it exposed it. The public now knew that the man investigators had originally pursued was innocent and that the biological evidence had always belonged to someone else. The contrast was stark. In the 1980s, investigators had a crime and an unknown perpetrator. In the 1990s, they had an innocent man and an unidentified DNA profile. In 2020, they had a DNA profile and a name. Each stage represented a different level of understanding, but the human cost remained constant. Christine's family had spent decades without an answer. Morin had spent years fighting to prove his innocence, and the real killer had lived for decades without being identified publicly. When police announced Hoover's identity, they also appealed to anyone who knew him to come forward. Investigators wanted to reconstruct his movements and understand his life around the time of the murder. This appeal produced numerous tips. Some people had known Hoover personally. Others may have encountered him casually. Investigators hope that decades-old memories might help fill the gaps left by his death, but reconstructing a person's life 36 years later is difficult. People change. Records disappear. Locations are altered. Memory becomes uncertain. A witness who was 30 in 1984 might be 66 by 2020. A neighbor might have moved several times. A former colleague might remember the person, but not the date of a particular event. A photograph might show someone standing beside Hoover, but not explain where they were or why. Every piece of information required verification, and the investigators had another reason to be cautious. The history of the case demanded it. They had already seen what happened when assumptions overwhelmed evidence. The new investigation could not simply replace one theory with another. It had to be built on the forensic evidence and corroborated wherever possible. That is why the DNA identification was so important. It provided something the original investigation lacked: a direct biological connection between Hoover and evidence from Christine's murder. But even a strong forensic connection cannot automatically answer every question surrounding a crime. It cannot explain motive by itself. It cannot describe every action. It cannot tell investigators what the victim experienced. Those questions require other forms of evidence, and after 36 years, those forms of evidence may be incomplete. That was the tragedy facing investigators in 2020. They had reached the identity of the man believed responsible, but the passage of time had removed many of the tools that could have helped explain his actions. Hoover was dead. His contemporaries had aged. Some witnesses had died. Others may have forgotten details. The original physical environment had changed. Yet investigators continued searching. More than 60 tips were received after the public announcement, showing that the case still had the power to awaken memory. For the Jessup family, those memories were inseparable from the pain of October 1984. The image of Christine as a missing 9-year-old had remained fixed for decades. Her family did not get to watch her grow older. They did not get to see who she would become. They could only imagine the woman she might have been. That is one of the cruelest aspects of a childhood homicide. The victim's future becomes a collection of unanswered possibilities. Every year that passes adds another imagined milestone that will never happen. A 10th birthday, a graduation, a first job, friendships, relationships, ordinary adulthood. None of it could occur because Christine's life ended when she was 9, and while her family lived with that absence, the investigation repeatedly changed shape. First, there was hope. Then fear, then grief, then the belief that a killer had been found, then the revelation that the wrong man had been convicted, then years of silence, then DNA, then genetic genealogy, then Hoover's name. Each stage reopened wounds that had never completely healed. The final identification therefore carried complicated emotions. There was relief because the killer was no longer unknown. There was anger because the answer had taken 36 years. There was sorrow because the man was dead and could never face the consequences in court. There was also the knowledge that the original investigation had caused another profound injustice. Morin's life had been altered because the wrong person was pursued. The case therefore became a reminder that solving a murder is not only about identifying a perpetrator, it is also about ensuring that the process does not destroy innocent lives along the way. In Christine's case, the truth eventually emerged, but only after enormous damage had been done. The most remarkable part was that the decisive clue had survived all of it. The DNA had survived the original investigation. It survived the prosecution of Morin. It survived his wrongful imprisonment. It survived his exoneration. It survived years when investigators could do little with it. It survived long enough for genetic genealogy to become possible, and it survived long enough to identify Hoover after his death. The biological evidence became a kind of silent witness that never changed its story. Human beings changed their theories. Courts reached conclusions. Technology evolved. Years disappeared. But the DNA remained what it had always been. It belonged to the man investigators eventually identified as Christine's killer, and that is why the case remains so powerful decades after the crime. It is not simply a story about a murder solved through DNA. It is a story about how truth can survive mistakes, survive time, and survive the death of the person who carried it. But truth does not always arrive complete. Hoover's identity could be established. The full circumstances of Christine's final hours could not. The evidence could tell investigators who had left a biological trace. It could not tell them everything he had done. It could not provide the answers a courtroom might have demanded, and it could not give Christine's family the one thing they had lost forever. 36 years had passed between the day Christine disappeared and the day police finally named the man responsible. 36 years of questions, 36 years of uncertainty, 36 years during which the world changed while one terrible mystery remained frozen in the past. Then, suddenly, a genetic connection opened the door. The unknown man had a name, Calvin Hoover. The case was officially no longer unsolved, but the deepest mystery had not disappeared. It had simply moved. It was no longer about identity. It was about the truth contained inside the final hours of a little girl's life, a truth that may have died with the man investigators finally identified. The name Calvin Hoover had finally given investigators something they had been missing since 1984, but it also forced the case into an uncomfortable final stage. For decades, detectives had been trying to identify an unknown man. Now they knew who that man was. Yet the person they identified was already dead, and that meant the traditional machinery of justice could not operate. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, and no trial. There would be no opportunity for prosecutors to place Hoover before a judge and reconstruct the evidence in open court. There would be no jury asked to decide his guilt. Instead, the conclusion came through forensic science, investigative review, and a DNA match that connected him to biological evidence recovered after Christine Jessup was murdered. It was an extraordinary ending to an extraordinary case, but it was also an ending filled with unanswered questions. To understand why the breakthrough mattered so much, it is necessary to return to the terrible mistake at the heart of the investigation. Guy Paul Morin. Morin had been Christine's neighbor. He became a suspect, then an accused man, then a convicted murderer. His first conviction came in 1986. His second conviction followed a retrial in 1992. For the public, 2 convictions could create the impression that the mystery had finally been solved. But Christine's actual killer was still free. The biological evidence would eventually prove it. When DNA testing became available, investigators could compare the biological material recovered from Christine with Morin's genetic profile. The result was unequivocal. The DNA did not belong to him. Morin was acquitted in 1995. The case that had once appeared closed suddenly became one of Canada's most infamous unsolved murders. The implications were enormous. If Morin was innocent, then the real killer had successfully escaped detection. Worse, the investigation had spent years focusing on the wrong man while the true perpetrator remained unidentified. The case, therefore, became a study in investigative tunnel vision. A theory had developed around Morin, and that theory had become powerful enough to survive challenges. The eventual DNA evidence exposed the danger of that process. It showed that a conviction could exist while the underlying theory was wrong. It showed that certainty could be manufactured by repetition, and it showed that forensic science could sometimes reveal the truth only after the justice system had already caused irreversible harm. But the DNA that cleared Morin also created a new opportunity. It provided investigators with a genetic profile belonging to the unknown man connected to the crime. The challenge was finding him for years. Conventional DNA searches did not produce the identity investigators needed. The profile existed, but no direct match appeared. That meant the case could remain frozen indefinitely. Then genetic genealogy opened a new path. Instead of waiting for a direct criminal database match, investigators could search for relatives of the unknown person through genealogical databases. The process was painstaking. A distant relative did not mean that investigators had found the killer. It meant they had found a branch of a family tree. From there, investigators could reconstruct relationships, examine generations, and identify possible individuals who fit the circumstances of the crime. Eventually, the trail led toward Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been 28 in 1984. He lived in Toronto and was known within the wider social environment surrounding the Jessup family. His wife had been interviewed during the original investigation. Hoover himself apparently had not been interviewed. and after Christine disappeared, he participated in the search for her. The discovery was deeply disturbing because it meant the person eventually identified through DNA had not existed outside the community's awareness. He had been part of the environment surrounding the case, but investigators still needed to verify the genetic lead. A genealogical connection was not enough. The crucial confirmation came through a DNA sample associated with Hoover after his death in 2015. The profile matched the biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing. That match was the turning point. After 36 years, the unknown genetic profile had a name: Calvin Hoover. Police announced the identification in October 2020. The announcement was extraordinary because it effectively solved a murder that had resisted generations of investigation. But it was also profoundly unusual because the person identified could never be prosecuted. Hoover had been dead for 5 years. The legal system could not impose a sentence on a dead man. The case therefore ended without the courtroom conclusion that normally follows a murder investigation. Instead, the evidence itself became the conclusion. Police stated that if Hoover were alive, he would have been arrested and charged with Christine's murder. The statement reflected the confidence investigators had in the forensic evidence, but it also acknowledged the reality that no trial would ever occur. That left investigators with one final task: determining what could still be learned about the crime itself. The identification of Hoover did not automatically explain how Christine had been abducted, what happened to her after she disappeared, or why the killer had chosen her. It did not reconstruct the entire sequence of events. It did not provide a motive. It did not reveal every location connected to the crime. It did not tell investigators what Hoover had done immediately before or after the murder. Those answers would require information beyond DNA. That was why police appealed to the public after announcing Hoover's identity. Investigators wanted anyone who had known him to come forward. They wanted information about his life in 1984, his relationships, his movements, and anything unusual people might remember. The appeal was not simply about proving guilt. The DNA had already established the forensic connection. The investigators were trying to reconstruct the missing history. More than 60 tips reportedly came in after the announcement. That response demonstrated that the case still carried emotional power decades after Christine's death. People who had once known Hoover might have been reminded of him. People who had lived near the Jessup family might have remembered events that had seemed meaningless at the time. A person might suddenly remember seeing Hoover somewhere on a particular day. Another might recall a conversation. Someone might possess an old photograph that placed him in a particular location. These fragments could potentially help investigators understand the circumstances surrounding Christine's final hours, but there was a danger in reopening memories after so much time. Memory can change. People can unknowingly incorporate information learned later into their recollections. Headlines can influence perception. Once Hoover's name became public, people might look back at ordinary interactions and reinterpret them through the knowledge that he had been identified as the killer. Investigators therefore had to distinguish between what could be independently verified and what was simply retrospective suspicion. That caution was especially important because the Christine Jessup case had already demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of allowing assumptions to dominate an investigation. The wrongful conviction of Moran was not merely a historical footnote. It was a warning about what could happen when investigators believed they had found the answer before they had actually established the truth. The final investigation, therefore, had to be different. Evidence first. Theory second. The DNA was the anchor. Everything else had to be evaluated around it. This approach also helped clarify what could and could not be said about Hoover. Investigators could identify him through the biological evidence. They could establish his age at the time of the murder. They could establish his connection to the Jessup family. They could establish that he had died in 2015, but other details remained uncertain. There was no confession. There was no trial testimony. There was no cross-examination. There was no living suspect who could challenge the evidence or provide an explanation. The final truth, therefore, existed in an unusual form. It was scientifically powerful but narratively incomplete. For Christine's family, that incompleteness must have been painful. Families of homicide victims often wait for the day when the killer is arrested and prosecuted because a trial can provide a public reconstruction of what happened. Witnesses can testify. Evidence can be presented. Prosecutors can explain the sequence of events. The defendant can be confronted with the accusations. A judge can pronounce a sentence. None of that happened here. Instead, the family received a name from investigators, a name attached to DNA, a name attached to a man who had already died. That was the closest the case could come to a conventional conclusion. Yet the identification still mattered enormously. Christine was no longer a victim whose killer was officially unknown. The record could finally state that investigators had identified the person responsible. Morin's name could be separated from the crime with even greater certainty. The historical narrative could finally acknowledge that the original prosecution had targeted the wrong man, and the forensic evidence that had once served primarily to exclude Morin could now identify Hoover. The transformation was extraordinary. In the beginning, DNA had been used to show what the evidence did not mean. It did not belong to Morin. Decades later, DNA showed what it did mean. It belonged to Hoover. The same type of evidence that had helped dismantle a wrongful conviction eventually helped identify the true perpetrator. That progression illustrates why preserving forensic evidence matters. Scientific capabilities change. A sample that seems limited today may become decisive tomorrow. Investigators cannot always know which technologies will exist in the future, but they can preserve the evidence that future technologies may need. Christine's case proved the value of that principle in the most dramatic way. A biological trace collected in 1984 remained useful decades later. It survived the collapse of one investigation and became the foundation of another. But science could not reverse time. It could not give Christine back her life. It could not return the lost years to Morin. It could not give the Jessup family the ordinary future they had imagined for their daughter. And it could not force Hoover to answer questions that only he could answer. Those limitations made the final stage of the case profoundly emotional. The world had waited 36 years for a name. When the name finally came, it brought truth, but not restoration. It brought identification, but not a trial. It brought certainty about the killer's identity, but not certainty about every detail surrounding the murder. And it brought the past back into public